All right, we are live for my next stream on the ongoing war in Ukraine, and today we have a great lineup for you. We've got first, I think it's their first appearance on the channel, Wandering Ruski. Hello,
Hey, what's up? Glad to be here.
and then we have Argent. I can't recall if you've joined us for any of these streams before either.
I've been on your channel before, but not for this specifically.
Right, and then of course we have returning Hunger the Die Merchant and Raging Mandrill.
Always a pleasure.
Glad to be back.
Today we are going to do the typical thing we do on these streams. We're going to do some frontline updates, and we're going to talk about the war generally. So to start us off, I will get right into some frontline updates. We'll bring up the Deep State UA map here, which is Ukrainian biased, but that's okay. So quick updates on things that have been happening. We'll go from left to right or south to north. So as people may recall, there was this amphibious operation going on basically forever in, I don't even remember the name of the Krinky. Yeah, that was it. Krinky, the Krinky operation where the Ukrainians have been, sending their forces across the Dnieper River for months and months and months. That is just over now, finally. So that all amounted to nothing. So the Kherson front has been pretty quiet now after that operation ended. There's really nothing going on over here. And then the other minor update, yeah, you can.
I just wanted to say, I feel so bad for the Ukrainian army.
Yeah,
I mean, feel the need to always say that they're led by like Zelensky and Blinken and Biden and stuff, and they're forced to do stuff like that. It's just such a waste of brave men.
I do kind of figure that one of the ways this may end is the Ukrainian army is going to get tired of being fed into the meat grinder. I think the Kursk operation might accelerate that, depending on how it goes. But we'll see. We'll get to.
No,
that.
I just always want to just pay kind of tribute to the what the Ukrainian armies had to deal with, and the fact that they haven't broken. I think is a testament to them.
One thing I want to add to that is that the strongest weapon that the Ukrainians do have is not any of these fancy Western, Wunderwaffen weapons that they've been. It's the biggest thing that's kept Ukraine in this fight the longest is their morale, their belief in their cause. This is what's caused them to be able to hold the ground and just basically keep Russia a much larger and stronger army that outguns them. Basically to just small gains. It's their morale. But one thing you can say about Ukraine that you could say about Ukraine is that, regardless of anything else, is that they're one of the most strongest people, in this war. I mean, they're, that's the strongest thing they have. And
what's the expression? They're donkeys. No, sorry, they're lions led by donkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was from that's not a sort of a subversive World War I expression, but yeah, no, I mean, I definitely respect and admire the Ukrainian soldiers, and I don't have anything against the Ukrainian people at all, and it's really just their government that I think is completely deranged at this point, and they don't deserve to be fed into this meat grinder like it's been going on.
Yeah,
sorry for
and just remember,
Krinky. Like to say that.
Just remember, the Krinky operation lasted what? It was 8 months. I mean, it was they basically didn't advance any territory beyond landing on the side of the river. They captured the town of Krinky for a very brief period of time.
Yeah,
and then
for
not
the
even
next
the
8
months. It was basically a slaughterhouse. This was like the 21st century Dardanelles. Churchill was absolutely destroyed by the Dardanelles campaign, and the Ukrainians do a 21st century version of the Dardanelles, and it's a giant tragedy and such a waste of genuinely tough, talented people. And these were elite people. These were Ukrainian Marine forces and naval infantry.
One thing I want to add to all this is that
Oh, did you cut out?
I think we lost him.
Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you now. I think.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm here. Do you guys hear
cool.
me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no. But one thing I want to add. Give me Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I'll just say the Dardanelles analogy is something I hadn't thought of before, but I think it's pretty apt because, that operation. I mean, we don't really know what the extent of the Cranky operation was intended to be, but yeah, the Dardanelles, they just, they arrived on the beach and then just basically sat there for months getting bombed and destroyed. And this whole operation was really bizarre because the Ukrainians just kept feeding men across this one, outlet through the Dnieper River, and they just got bombed for months and months and months on end. And it looks like hundreds of people died in this operation. And it's like, what were they doing there?
How did they think they were going to supply people across a river the Russians had fire control over?
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, as you can see, I mean, this river isn't always wide open. It may be now after the dam breaking. I'm not sure what the actual terrain looks like. I recall seeing before videos of Ukrainians crossing this area on small speedboats, and you could tell that these little I don't know the geographic term for these little micro rivers, but you can tell that the Ukrainians were navigating these. So it's just a total kill zone, and then you're just landing right here, and they never really broke out of this area. So
I mean, you can't bring heavy equipment across.
This is an example of strategic priorities overriding tactical and operational considerations. It's a classic blunder, militarily speaking. Zelensky has a massive promise internationally as well as domestically to reclaim the Crimea. And I would imagine that is one reason among many, motivationally speaking, to continue this operation when it's clear it's not working.
One thing I would add to that is also remember the Krinky operation was happening at the same time as the Russian offensive in Avdiivka, and along the entire front, the Russians had the initiative. And beyond just trying to say they're trying to reach Crimea, what Zelensky wanted to show is that we're not just getting pushed back on all fronts. Like, we're also being on the offensive. They didn't want to, again, it's the same thing with what's happening in Kursk, is because they want to show that they're also they don't want to give the Russians the initiative for the entire front. They want to show, again, as we mentioned before this stream, that like one of the main things Ukraine needs to do is to give a little like strip show basically to the Western people, because they're like, hey, it's worth to give us money, and look, we're actually going on the offensive, because it's a lot harder. It's like, why would we give you money if you're like falling back all the time?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you watched our previous streams, but that was basically our analysis of what was happening in Krinky, is that they just had to show themselves as attacking the Russians somewhere, even if it was basically just a rolling disaster.
Honestly, I think one of them just watched Saving Private Ryan and like, you know what, that was a great scene. Let's do that.
Well, no, actually, no. They actually named one of
they did
battalions like the out of the
they named them like Sword and Juno, and I think they named the beaches.
Are you serious? I didn't actually know that.
That's ridiculous. Like, that's totally Marvel Cinematic Universe indeed.
Well, Ukraine Cinematic Universe, but I don't remember exactly what it was, but they were naming stuff there after stuff from B-Day.
Yeah, like one of the units was like the named after like one of the main army that was like attacking at like one of the main U.S. Army.
I think there was Omaha and Norman. There's
the tactical group Omaha or something.
This is ridiculous. It's like, SS Galicia is invading Juno Beach on the Dnieper River. It's just ridiculous. This shit is just.
Well, when you have like a extremely gay history, like when your history is like basically like just became into existence in the 20th century, like you have to kind of LARP from like other people. So,
all right. Well, let's get into some of the other stuff real quick. So, I mean, we really quickly, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take Tokmak, basically, we've talked about this many times. They got held up basically in this area. The Russians have taken a lot of that back. This is a pretty minor front. The Russians clearly don't really care about this other than for prestige. The Russians allegedly have now taken back the entire, what's called the Surovikin line and the village of Rabatne, to the extent that it even exists at this point. So more or less, the front line is basically restored to the pre-counteroffensive position. You can see the territory the Ukrainians took back from the Russians in green. So, yeah, I mean, the counteroffensive was like over a year ago at this point. it really amounted to nothing. There's nothing to really say at this point about Robotany and anything else going on in this area that hasn't been said many times already. This front is active to the extent that the Russians are, occasionally launching attacks in these various directions, especially towards Velkia, Novoselica, and the Russians have actually taken back Staromayorsk, and I cannot recall if the Ukrainians captured this territory to the south, but the Russians have sort of made some minor advancements back towards Velka, Novoselica, taking Staromayorsk and just sort of resetting this front. But not strategically or at a larger operational level, there's really nothing going on really anywhere west of Ugladar. Pretty much everything on this part of the front is pretty stale, and there's very little of interest happening there. Of course, once we get from Ugladar all the way to Avdiivka, that's really where the action is at this point, and we'll get into that now, unless anyone wants to say anything about, I guess, the Zaporozhye area. Cool. Yeah, I figured nothing really to talk about there. So there's things to say on Ugladar, but we will start with the main area of interest, which, as you know, I think the last stream I covered, the Russians had just taken Avdiivka, and the front line looked something like, I don't know, like this. And the Russians controlled roughly that territory when I had last streamed. And
Yeah, that you see that river, Charlie, from Lastochkina to Orlivka to Berdichi. That was the front line.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Or let me switch to blue. The crayons in this map are really cool. This is dope. Yeah, so the front line was roughly on this river. That was like the first line of defense that the Ukrainians had after Avdiivka. And as we know, I think one of the brigades that's now deployed in Kursk was deployed here to sort of, plug the gap while the retreat happened. And, this line held for like a week or two, but then the Russians pushed past it. I think they had just taken Okrutine when I had streamed, which of course allowed them to move south and flank this river and the fortifications. And what's also happened since then is, as the Russians have done in this war, we will highlight this rail line here. The Russians love rail lines, and they have followed this rail line all the way to Novogradivka, whatever, right? So this is a rail line. Rail lines have what's called wind breaks around them. You've probably seen them in your country. It's just, tree lines. So the rail is literally like a hallway leading across terrain, which is obviously really useful. And we can also look at, I will share another tab here really quick. We can look at the topographic map real quick. You can see the rail line right here is on the high ground. The red is the high ground leading out of Avdiivka. So this is a very operationally important rail line. And the Russians took Okrutine, and that pretty much opened up the whole front from there. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Raging Mandrel, and you can start talking about the geography, or we can get into the ammunition article, whichever you prefer.
I'll start with the geography. So as you can see on the map, there are some very easy defendable choke points that Ukraine could possibly utilize in this area, right? However, all of those defensible choke points are outflanked by this rail line and that high ground. So most of the defensible terrain that Ukraine has lies along mostly these little river valleys, because in river valleys there are forests and things, and that's just dense terrain that you could occupy, and there's little towns, and it's a choke point. These are natural choke points that Russia would have to use very operationally significant equipment in order to cross. So they're just going to ignore all of this stuff and go around. I originally believed a few months ago when I initially made my prediction that the Russians would try to use the highways. This is an example of thinking like a NATO commander, not a Russian. The Russians have basically not advanced substantially towards Kharkov, towards the south of this initial defensive L formation. It's just off the screen here, but so really what the Russians are doing is a classic oblique order strategy here. They are in every sector of the line of contact, basically doing a matching of 1-to-1 in terms of personnel and equipment. And in the sector where they're intending to advance, they're placing more manpower, obviously, and they're outnumbering the Ukrainians in the location that the attack is occurring. And that is one reason among many why they are advancing in relatively quick fashion. So the big thing that they're using here is infantry and mechanized rifle brigades and lots of artillery, as well as FABs. The Russians have pretty much used FABs to great effect, even since they began being used right around the time Avdiivka was besieged. And if you look at some of the maps that actually log the individual events, you'll notice that the Russians have a tendency to saturate with FAB bombings, basically all along the line of their advance.
Can you explain what a FAB is really quick, just for anyone who doesn't know?
Sure. A FAB is a FAB 500 or FAB series bomb, which is a glide bomb. It's basically the Russian equivalent to JDAM, or Joint Direct Attack Munition, which, in layman's terms, you're taking a normal aircraft dropped bomb and you're sticking a gyroscope and some wings on it. Yeah, conversion kit. I'm explaining for people who who aren't technically aware. But yeah, you put some wings on it, you put a gyroscope on it, you launch it on a plane that's 30,000 feet in the air, it glides into position, right, and lands on target with very, very, it's almost a precision guided munition. Not nearly as accurate, but it's close enough.
But the thing is, though, just why they're so important is they're extremely cheap. Like, they literally just took the massive stockpile of conventional bombs. I think it only costs a couple $1,000s to just put the basic glider kit on. So Russia can just use a lot of them, and they're much cheaper than ballistic or cruise missiles.
Exactly. And the great thing about them is that they are air launched, so you can just use a Su-24, 25, which Russia has plenty of, among other aircraft. And this is a huge panic moment for NATO, and it's one reason why you're hearing so much about the latest Wunderwaffe, the F-16, and why the Ukrainians are desperately receiving additional surface-to-air munitions, as well as F-16s from the West. That's why
glide bombs be intercepted?
I mean, they can, like any other missile. I don't know the technical specifications of what its radar cross section would look like or anything like that, but I'm sure it can be. But what you don't want to, right? So this is,
I believe since it's not self-propelled, it is more difficult to intercept, because normally you would be honing in on the infrared signature.
Not even infrared signature. Normal missiles have it. Well, it depends on the type of missile. If you have a radar array, if you're using a seeker on a missile, that's going to send out a radar signature, which can be detected by a surface-to-air battery radar and associated EW platforms, and that will allow you to intercept the missile. Right? This doesn't have that. And really, you don't want to intercept the missiles all the time, or the JDAMs all the time. You want to kill the aircraft that launches it. That's the main point here.
Right, also, because the FABs are so cheap, it's kind of a waste of a Patriot or some other missile to shoot them down.
Yeah.
One thing to also add to that is that since the plane could shoot it from way behind the front lines, unless the Ukrainians use their limited, the very rare, they're running out of air defense systems, and if they want to put them all the way up to the front line, which could then be targeted, they don't want to risk that, and that's why it's a lot safer for the Russian aircraft to be able to send these FAB bombs from more behind, many kilometers behind the front line, so they can't be targeted by conventional Ukrainian air defense. So that's another upside with it.
You can have your fighter back here, 20 kilometers or so behind the front, and launch the guided bomb from way back there, and then the aircraft's basically immune to anything that the Ukrainians would fire at it, right? So it's just sort of they can basically use these guided bombs at will on the Ukrainians, and they can't really do anything about it. And of course, that's how Avdiivka was conquered in the first place. Was they really ramped up the Fab 500 usage?
Yes, and it's not like the Russians haven't had difficulty. This is a very new weapon system for them. It was previously having glide bomb capability was something that was exclusive to NATO forces for many years. So this is a new development in achieving parity in one very specific weapon system for the Russians.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to bring up, actually, because we saw a couple of weeks ago, actually, a sort of embarrassing set of videos where they were testing their new Fab 1500s, which just
Fab 3000.
It was actually a 3000, and they were trying to hit this apartment block, and they kept missing it. Although it was, it missed it by a few meters, but that's really important, especially when you're launching a payload of that magnitude. You don't want to waste them, right? Because you're just wasting money. And it missed, but now they're testing things out, and in very quickly the Fab 3000s, I'm sure, will be just as accurate as the 500s. So the Russians have this new enormous arsenal of guided bombs simply by converting older weapons to these guided kits. Let me actually bring up like a picture of these things.
Just for perspective, I think this is always important. The U.S. produces 550 Patriot missiles a year, and that's for the entire world. So just to keep into perspective how many they theoretically, at absolute maximum, could shoot down, isn't Russia using thousands a month now? Or is it still just hundreds?
I believe it's like I think at least the low thousands, like in the 1,000 range now per month.
Yeah, so this is the Fab 3,000 pound bomb.
Yeah, it doesn't look very complicated, does it?
It's a lot. One thing to note on your point, Charlemagne, is that it's a lot harder to guide a 3,000 pound bomb than it is a 500 pound bomb, obviously. But also, the thing is that when you drop a 3,000 pound bomb on something, even if you're not exactly accurate, the explosive load is will destroy it anyway. Unlike with a 500 one where you have to be more precise with. But even if you miss it by a little bit, it's the explosive do a lot of damage. One thing to also note about you mentioned about how the Russian military is trying to improve in its use is because Russian doctrine, when it came to fighting NATO, would actually not be using. It would be mostly be using its air defense systems. However, since Ukraine doesn't really have an air, the air defense has basically just kind of been on standby, trying to shoot down drones or and such like that. And the whole Russian Air Force doctrine was basically we're not going to really contest NATO for the skies. We'll let NATO try to bomb us, but we'll be able to shoot down their their airplanes. It actually kind of a reverse happened in the early stages of the war, where Ukraine, kind of following the same sort of Soviet doctrine, was able to, even though the Russians had a much stronger air force, were able to deny the Russians air supremacy or even superiority over Ukraine, because the Russians can't just freely, liberally fly their fighter jets, all across Ukraine, because they could be shot down. And that's why, so it's kind of a reverse happened. So now they're the ones having to actually use their air force offensively instead of defensively, which is what they kind of been trained for. So it's a bit of a learning experience for them.
Yeah, and I also want to add on the Fab as well before we move on. The overpowered nature of Soviet apartment blocks, concrete apartment blocks, as we've seen in Ugledar, have given the Russians a lot of trouble and have taken a very long time to just destroy places with conventional and rocket artillery. So Fabs are kind of a direct counter, because as a glide munition, they don't have to be as precise as a precision guided munition. If you're just attacking a gigantic apartment block, you can land a Fab 3000 on an apartment block and it will blow out the apartment block from the inside out. Whereas if you are firing conventional artillery, there's precision and accuracy issues with that, and it's a 152 millimeter round is not going to knock down an apartment block the same way as a Fab of substantial size can. And so this is also one way that the Russians have found a hard counter to the Ukrainian defensive tactics of using these little fortified towns and villages with extremely old yet very solid Soviet concrete apartment buildings.
Yes. So we're looking at Ugladar here. And, this fortress has just stood for over 900 days at this point, and the Russians just cannot crack it. You can see on the map here, it's basically just this citadel of apartment blocks, and these things simply cannot be destroyed by the type of munitions you're talking about. But we've seen some Fab 3000s exploding on these things, not these buildings in particular, but other similar types of buildings. And when they're actually hit by a Fab 3000, the buildings are destroyed, right? Which is something the Russians couldn't do before. They couldn't simply take down the entire building if it was a problem.
Is
but
that
now
part
they
of
can.
why Bakhmut was such a struggle?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Back during that time, they didn't have anything larger than a Fab 500, right? And of course, Bakhmut is this enormous city with a much even more, high-rise buildings, and the Ukrainians could hold up there, and it would protect you from artillery fire. And as we saw in the previous article, right, it said the Russians are now using 3,500 Fabs a month, which is an insane amount of ordnance, especially given the size of these bombs, right? So this is one of the big factors in the war right now, is these guided bombs. The Ukrainians have really no counter to, and actually the article mentioned that the range of these is like 50 to 70 kilometers. I will bring up the Institute for the Study of War map real quick. And
just for reference, I believe an ATACMS has about a 500-pound warhead.
And you can see, I mean, look, this is 50 miles, so 50 kilometers would be like, I don't know, 2/3 of that or something. So the Russians could fire these, 500-pound bombs, or drop them rather, from aircraft way behind the front line, like halfway to Russian territory, if, they're launching it at Pokrovsk or something like that. So the aircraft's going to be dropping the bomb from, well beyond the front line. So they're also very quiet too, so there's very little indication that these things are even arriving. So anyway, let's get back to the front line in Pokrovsk. So I'll bring that map back up. Let me find the correct tab here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so yeah, Manjel, do you want to continue?
Sure. After that very lengthy aside,
well, that's why we're here. I mean, these are the important things in the war, right?
Exactly. These are developments that are ongoing. And speaking of developing developments, or ongoing developments, I should say. So we established that the Russians are largely following this rail track that runs from Avdiivka through to Ocheretina and to Novohrodivka and up to Pokrovsk. And we mentioned that rail line basically is outflanking the L-shaped defensive or possible defensive area that the Ukrainians could build along the river pathways that run from Kharkov down and then westwards. And there's terrain that helps them down there as well. However, the Russians basically decided that, okay, instead we're going to just go all around all of these possible defensive areas with all of this annoying little terrain features and little villages that can be defended. And so they're just going to strike straight at Pokrovsk. Now, the pace of advance has largely been on foot. It's been a plodding advance. There's lots of little fortifications that the Ukrainians still retain, which brings up the other disparity here as well, which is the manpower disparity. The Russian gains here have, like I said before, been because they have numerical and material superiority in a single location, and the Ukrainians are now substantially complaining that they don't have enough manpower. And why they haven't gotten the manpower yet, or why they thought they didn't need the manpower is an open question. But they're reducing the mobilization age from 27 to 25. That's the maximum age that somebody can be called up for reserves. But essentially, so now you have a manpower crisis in a near a fortified city where your enemy outnumbers you, and you are also having your front line extended in other places as well. So this is one way of how you can operationally spread a defensive a defensive line and force your opponents to maneuver or prevent them from redeploying reinforcements from other sectors to a critical area like Pokrovsk.
Yeah, so this is important too. I'm glad you brought that up. When the front line was at Avdiivka, it was much shorter, but this salient has massively extended the length of the front line, because curved lines are longer than a straight line, right? So the Ukrainians have much more line to defend here, and also not. Avdiivka was a fortress city, right? Fortified for literally 10 years. That's where the front line was. Now they're operating off of these earthworks behind rivers that you can see, highlighted here in blue. And the problem is that these aren't as easy to defend as Avdiivka was. They don't have the manpower for it. And the Russians, because they took Okrutine and have been following this rail, have simply been going around these rivers. You can see here they're outflanking the next line of fortifications. So the Ukrainians have fortified, this river with these reservoirs here, but the Russians have simply going around it, and now they're going to outflank it from the rear, just like they did the previous line over here, and that's going to completely open up Pokrovsk. Another issue they have is Seladove here. You can see the Russians are actually moving towards the south and threatening Seladove, which is a sort of a development that we didn't really even expect, because what that is actually going to do is it's going to threaten all of this line down here that the Ukrainians have built up as a fallback behind this part of the front. As we know, the Russians, this is an actual development I almost skipped over. The Russians have taken Krasnogorivka, which was a sort of frontline settlement. Actually, if I bring up the Syriac map, we can see the original front line. So let me switch to that really quick. There we go. So Syriac maps outlines the original front line. And you can see this is really the only part of that front line that's still standing. Krasnogorivka was behind it. And now, so the Ukrainians are now going to fall back once this village north of Krasnogorivka is taken. The Ukrainians are going to fall back to this river line, right? That's the Volchta River, yeah. So they like being on these rivers. Obviously, that's like ideal defensive terrain. But the problem is if Seladove is taken or even logistically threatened, you can see how it acts as a hub for this entire front line, right? And there's this very large reservoir to the south here that is part of the Volchta River, right? But and there's high ground here too. So there's high ground north of the Volchta River here that the Ukrainians can utilize against the Russians. But all of this can be compromised if Seladove is taken, because it's going to destroy their logistics and outflank the entire line.
Yes, and it allows the Russians, after Seladova is taken, they can push down south along that major highway again and allow the forces near Kharkov to cross that river area and just outflank again. So, as you said, that this is not a defensible area so long as the Russians can outflank the whole thing.
Yeah, we're really getting back into maneuver warfare in this war, because basically what's happening is overall on this front, the Russians are going for Ugledar by cutting off the highway right here. The Russians are pushing in this direction from Krasnogorivka. They're pushing here potentially to get behind this line, and then they're pushing towards Pokrovsk, which is going to compromise the line to the north as well. So everything right here is going to be compromised very soon if the Russians succeed in these offensives that they're launching. We sort of have all this, the entire Donetsk front right now is sort of one big puzzle that the Russians are solving. Anyway, let's get back to Pokrovsk. What else do you have for us here?
I will. note that the Russians have reportedly received substantial reinforcements. We've heard tell that the Russians now have somewhere between 500 to 700,000 men actually in Ukraine right now. I don't know if that number, if the 700,000 number is before or after the casualties for the last 2 years are taken into account and deducted from that number offhand, but that is a substantial number compared to what they originally had, which was the 100, 150,000 during the initial invasion. And that brings the Russians into greater, or closer to numerical parity with the Ukrainian army.
One thing I want to also add to that is that in the beginning of this war is that when Putin said he wanted to do a special military operation, it wasn't like obfuscation. That's actually what he wanted to do. A quick, I know it's a meme to say 3 days, that the Russians didn't say 3 days. That was Mark Milley, but it was supposed to be quick. It was supposed to be like a 1 month thing, would topple the Ukrainian government, do regime change, and then the new Russian government would recognize Crimea and then have the Donbass vote to join Russia. Then Russia would have withdrawn from all of Ukraine. And this kind of and cut me off if this kind of goes off from the Pokrovsk thing, but it's the whole strategic. Like if we were looking at like the look of it, is that Putin does not actually want to annex Ukraine. The main purpose of this entire war was that he wanted to stop Ukraine from continuously moving towards the Western sphere. He wanted to keep Ukraine back in the Russian sphere. And that does not necessarily mean that Ukraine has to become part of Russia through annexation. In fact, there's I don't know if you guys remember, but in the early parts of this war, when the Russians were going through Kiev, when they were conquering towns, they were allowing the administrations, the local Ukrainian administrations, to keep the Ukrainian flag. They're like, just let us pass through here. Like, they weren't actually there to conquer. And that's actually why the thing is that in a war, the people who show up win. And in 2022, the Ukrainians showed up. They mobilized, they did mass mobilization, and the Russians were very lethargic. They didn't do mobilization until they got handed in Kharkov in 2022. And when you show up, even if you're outgunned like the Ukrainians are, you could still win, as we saw as the Ukrainians did. And if you want to win this war, you have to be willing to show up for it in any war, not just this war. And so one thing the Russians are slowly but surely doing is that they're slowly like they're finally targeting the power generation facilities. It wasn't until earlier this summer where Russia actually targeted Ukraine's power generation. While as if I remember, when America invaded Iraq, we knocked out their on day one. Like, I don't know what the point. I'm not a fly in the. But it seems like Putin, the way Putin wants to do this war, and I think Argent mentioned that Russia could end this war very quickly if they actually wanted to show up very hard. But that would require a lot of if they want to do a massive what they call big arrow offensive, like the type 2, that would do a bunch of casualties very much quickly. But it would actually hasten the war a lot. But since that would. What Putin doesn't like is that he doesn't like destabilization. That's why he has not done more mobilization than what's needed. He's relying entirely on contracts, volunteers, and so
not entirely, but mostly.
Yeah. He did that one mobilization because the Russians literally had their lines collapse and they needed to infuse troops immediately. But one thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to win this war, if Russia wants to win this war, it has to actually fight for it, and because Russia is so much more bigger than Ukraine, it could do this kind of small World War I style kind of slow gains, and for maybe a lower cost, maybe they lose a lot less daily than they would in large offensives, along with equipment losses. That those are a lot more reduced in this kind of more that we see. But at the same time is that this also prolongs the war a lot longer than it could be. One thing I want to know is that Ukraine actually is doing a lot of they're showing up to fight. They're here to kick ass. But Russia is not putting as much 100% of its effort into the fight, which is why Ukraine's actually being able to stand up for as long as it has been.
Two things to add on to that. Firstly, the one benefit about Russia not going all in is it means that they're not really running that much of a budget deficit, and their economy isn't really straining at all. to maintain this, so they can kind of just keep this going indefinitely. The other thing to keep in mind is, to my understanding, the soldiers that Russia recruits go through full normal training, whatever it is, 6-8 months, but they're fully trained when they make it to the battlefield. There's articles I've seen that the Ukrainian soldiers will only get like sometimes a week of training, sometimes a month or two before they're just kind of thrown in. Whereas, so when we talk about like the sizes of the armies being about equal, one side is pretty much entirely trained, and the other is a lot of just conscripts who are basically there to fill in the lines.
That is true. But what I also add though is that like a mobilized person, like give them like a few weeks on the field and be better than like the pre-war like contract soldiers. If you took a contracted Ukrainian soldier before this war, like someone who just joined, versus someone who just most mobilized and has been on the front line for a few months, that person has would be a better soldier than the contracts, because obviously experience is the best training. But obviously, like, it's it just because they got mobilized, I want to add is that does not negate that like they'll forever like worse than a contract soldier. They might not be as much morale as the contract soldier, because obviously with a contract volunteered for it, so obviously there's a bigger motivation in that department, which is something to take into account. But one thing I would caution is that just because a bunch of in fact most of the Ukrainian army is mobilized, does not mean that they can't like that they're completely like weak.
I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of aspects to making a soldier, like working together as a unit, training them to shoot, training them to even just doing stuff like digging ditches, knowing how to do maneuvers. I'm not saying that I'm just saying they aren't being given the full set of tools that a soldier would normally get when they're being deployed to a high intensity conflict.
No, I mean, I watched this video. I'll switch to this tab. Actually, I watched the video the other day from Jimmy Thomas, who we like, and this video sort of discusses, I guess, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in a way, because he sort of goes through what's necessary and what's called a breaching operation to get through a minefield, basically, and it's unbelievably complicated, just the amount of coordination that has to happen within a brigade in order to do that operation, right? So this is not something you can just throw together with conscripts. You have to train for months and months to actually be able to do this effectively. So.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm happy you brought that up, Charlie, because I'm going to disagree with you, Ruski, on just one point, and it's the fact that I don't believe Russia could end this war, within a week if they wanted to. I mean, if they deployed like 3 million men, okay, sure, like that would be very likely that it would end quickly. But the reason there are no big aero offenses, and there haven't been big aero offenses for the entirety of this war on the Russian side, is because of the ISR aspect. It's because of the Western intelligence that it's almost practically impossible to concentrate any force bigger than a brigade on any point of the front line that will not be seen by the Ukrainians and will not be targeted by ballistic missiles, HIMARS, artillery, anything the Ukrainians can throw at them. That there's a reason we haven't seen big aero offenses, because there can't be in this kind of ISR environment.
And actually, no, I actually 100% agree with you. What I'm saying is that the Russians aren't treating this war as seriously I'm not saying that if they mobilized like that they would be able to do a big aero offensive and swatch. No, I will ever see a big aero offensive in this war again until one side collapses. Like I agree with you 100% on that. I'm just saying that like for example, why is there like still like why is obviously Russia has started targeting the power generation like facilities, but like why is there still electricity at all in Kiev? Like why do they still have warm showers? Like they're besides the front line, like this is like World War I, where basically like life is basically almost molested for the average Ukrainian, let alone the high elite who's actually like running this war. If Russia wanted to put you to its knees, it would try to destroy, like actually target like maybe the Dnieper bridges, but the Dnieper bridges are still standing. And there's a lot of things, and the only time Russia reacts is when it gets targeted. Like, for example, we never saw Russia actually target even the substations until Ukraine decided to bomb the Crimea bridge. The point I was trying to make is not that if they just mobilized and the attack they would win. I actually don't believe that's going to happen. As you mentioned with ISR, that's actually one of the biggest reasons why we don't see why offenses are a lot harder and why we reverted back to a World War I environment. And this is kind of like sorry, a little bit off the ceiling, but that's why we kind of see this kind of World War I type environment of slow tactical gains. It's because like one where we got the machine gun and stuff like that, where the offensive is a lot harder to pull off than the defensive, and that's why we see such small gains. But I was just saying that Russia could inflict a lot more damage on Ukraine than is trying to pursue a more humanitarian strategy in terms of applying this war, which, maybe you could say it's worth it. Maybe they, but I'm just saying that they could be a lot more deadlier on Ukraine than they currently are.
They could be, absolutely. But I think Putin, being a very lawyerly person, actually cares about humanitarian law and international law. I mean, people don't think about this. Like, people always compare the invasion of Ukraine to the invasion of Iraq, and that's just not the same case in any way, shape, or form. Like, Putin actually cares about the opinion of the international community. I mean, you can just compare the war that Israel is launching on Gaza, and like, if you want to see how Israel does not care about the international opinion, look at how Russia is conducting its war, and it's a huge difference.
Yeah, and whether or not, it's kind of irrelevant whether or not Putin actually cares about humanitarian causes or conduct, or, like you said, is just he's lawyerly and cares about it in the sense that it matters in terms of political power from like a purely Machiavellian perspective. The point is that he is towing the lines where possible in order to, not appear like what the Israelis are doing in Gaza right now.
Israel's killed substantially more civilians. Like, even if we assume that the numbers are inflated, I think it was earlier this year, it came out that only like 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have died.
Correct. I checked that out a few weeks ago. Far more civilians have been killed in Gaza at this point, in
even if the numbers are inflated,
even if they're inflated, then have been killed in Ukraine. Like, there have actually been very few civilian casualties in Ukraine. Now there are more military casualties, and especially KIA in particular. But yeah, that's pretty remarkable that across actually, if you add up the entire 10 years of the Ukraine conflict, Israel has already killed more civilians in Gaza. So,
well, especially considering how high intensity it is. Like, we have bombs, we have missiles, we have entire cities getting destroyed. Like, when I saw the number, I'm like, wow, that's it. It looks like it's almost entirely would just be from collateral damage, given how low the number is.
Yeah, Wandering Ruski also mentioned substations. So like, the Russians have targeted substations in the past, which are basically power distribution centers. And I think only this year they've actually started hitting the actual power plants themselves. Those take much longer to repair than a substation. We're talking the actual power generation facilities. There have been blackouts in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, but that's mostly because from taking out the substations that distribute the electricity and not the actual production itself. Now they've sort of switched to also targeting the power generation stations themselves.
They can't hit the nuclear ones, which are, I think, the biggest source. They've blown up the thermal and hydro, but they can't blow up the nuclear ones for obvious reasons. I think Ukraine imports most of its electricity now from Europe.
Yeah, I don't
there was
actually
an interesting there's actually, sorry, Charlie, there's an interesting thing that the Durain was talking about like a couple days ago, where Ukraine stopped supplying Hungary and Slovakia with oil through the oil pipeline in western Ukraine, and obviously it was Russian oil being transported through Ukraine. It's still being transported through Ukraine to this day, but Ukraine cut off that supply to Hungary and Slovakia, and the Hungarians and Slovakians responded by cutting off electricity supply to the Ukrainians. So this is the worst power situation the Ukrainians have had in the entirety of the war. They're no longer even getting power from Western Europe.
I think their only real electrical source within Ukraine is nuclear power. I think everything else has been destroyed at this point.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that front.
If I remember
Right.
correct, yeah, obviously the nuclear stuff is still operating. I think there's still some hydro, like they didn't actually blow up the physical. Like I think they've targeted them, but I don't think they physically like completely destroyed the hydroelectric generating, all of them at least. I think they've targeted a few of them, but not all of them.
Okay,
So
you're
I think
probably
there's still
right.
some, but they have destroyed. I think almost a bunch of like the main like thermal like coal fired and plants and all that.
So I've had highlighted up on the screen for a little while this quote from this Reuters article that we can get into. If you run I ran the numbers here. Basically, what we're looking at is if you just take these numbers and extrapolate them out for years, it comes out to something like by 2030, every single Ukrainian soldier has been killed. Obviously, the war is not going to last that long, but we're looking, according to this article, we now have hundreds of Ukrainian or more than 100 Ukrainian soldiers are getting killed per day at this point, and more than 1,000 wounded. That's at a very high burn rate, and if that increases, which it's likely to do unless something serious is done, the Ukrainian army is going to get burned out within a few years at this point. So you can sort of see the end in sight. Of course, wars don't end by 100% obliterating the other army, right? There at some point there's going to come a point where the Ukrainian army can, no longer prevent what we're calling a big arrow offensive. I should also comment on that really quick too, because we sort of have a bet going on here about big arrow offensives between Mandrel and Hunger and myself, and I think we've decided to count the. If they reach Pokrovsk, I believe we have agreed that it counts as a big arrow offensive. If we go out to the strategic view here, let me get rid of this tool. Yeah,
I have to stop you because you were giving some, I don't know what far right Russian disinfo source you were showing there, but Zelensky told me only 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died.
that's crazy. I remember him talking about that,
and I believe Zelensky. I think that was accurate.
So just so everybody knows that artillery number, the daily casualty rate, this is from artillery fire, is about 100,000 men per year. So the Ukrainians started with a active duty and reserve force of about 1.2 million. That's not counting, volunteers and conscripts after the war began. But 1.2 million minus by 100,000 per year, it's been 2.5 years. So that's 200.
Yeah.
300,000, quarter million men right now. So, yeah,
I believe it.
We know at least 250,000 casualties, and probably more than 100K KIA at this point for sure.
You also have to take into account. Sorry, you also have when you look at casualties, you have to take into account deeper strikes in the deep rear of Ukraine. This is just obviously the majority of casualties are on the front line, but Russia has been bombing like several kilometers behind the front line for basically 2.5 years, and very few people count those in their casualty.
Well, if they hit like the air defense facility outside of Kiev or something, they're going to be killing dozens, if not hundreds, of people in those attacks.
So I have on the map here the sort of big arrow. Basically, Mandrel called the Donetsk offensive specifically at Pokrovsk. I mean, this is a bit of a chode in terms of big arrows, but I think we agree that if they reach Pokrovsk by the elections, that this will count, and you will win a cigar from each of us. So that's the situation there. I know Hunger had bet on both Zaporozhye and a Kharkov big arrow, and obviously that's not happening. And I bet on 0, which I think I could make the case that there have still been 0, and this doesn't count. But I think the spirit of the bet will lead to Mandrel winning it if they reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk by the election, which is pretty soon. So it's getting interesting. They basically have to come up to here by the beginning of November.
Slight digression.
They've been making a lot of progress. I mean, if you look at those, if you look behind that front line, that's all within the past 2 weeks, less. From
the progress is insane. I remember during the old Glory Club conference, I was looking at the front, and it was I don't know, back here or something. And that was in the beginning of June. So, June, July, August. So about 3 months, and they took, this area. So it's kind of close to the wire, but the rate is actually picking up. I mean, specifically around this part of the front, the rate of advance has been insane compared
One thing I
to.
want to
Yeah,
add
go ahead.
on the Pokrovsk, as we're discussing Pokrovsk, that we were talking about how they're going along the rail line, and so far that's been paying dividend. And there's been some sort of like almost like I call it the Porez flower, because if you guys remember, once they took the village of Porez on the northern side of the Vochka River, that's kind of when they started like using the rail line to like explode into because the Ukrainians were kind of falling back, using the Vochachka River as like the new defense line after their 2014 defenses fell after the fall of Avdiivka. But it might after they reached it, like almost like before that, as you mentioned, once they Avdiivka fell, I thought like they were actually managed to hold off the Russians for a big, because remember Avdiivka fell in the end of February, which is a little while ago, and what happened was that the Russians were kind of stuck on like the Berdichi, Simonivka, Orlivka line that in that second river, and they were fighting there for a very long time. And it wasn't until Orchechny fell, which was because the Ukrainians fucked up and did the rotation, like they moved out units without replacing them, that Orchechny fell. And since major like logistics hub, they managed to like outcrack the Ukrainians, were able to actually start advancing. But it took them like all of March and April to do that, and then they slowly had to grind till Porez. And then it seems like since the Russians were able to get behind the defenses of the Vochachka River, they were able to advance a lot faster. So the gains we see to the west of Porez happened within the last, like, I think 3 weeks or so, while as everything from Porez to like Orchechny happened within like 2 or so. And so now the thing is that as they approach Pokrovsk, there's a lot of natural, there's a lot of ways they could defend it. And right now, a lot of there's 3 towns in particular that help the Russians as they approach Pokrovsk. Now, before we discuss that, is that the way the Russians try to attack is we saw this in Bakhmut, we saw this in Avdiivka, is that they basically through slow tactical gains try to slowly encircle a they don't usually attack it directly. They try to like slowly encircle it and then put the squeeze on it, and then basically make the defenses of that town or city basically hard to hold on to, and then force the Ukrainians to retreat, which is what we saw like in Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Severodonetsk. It's kind of like how the Russians like to try to approach it. Now, in order to take Pokrovsk, they're going to try to, even if they reach Pokrovsk, they're only going to reach the southern outskirts of the city. The Ukrainians still have the western highways and railroads to supply Pokrovsk. They have the northern, and they even have the eastern part. Now, so the Russians, and as they approach Pokrovsk, again, that extends the front lines for the Ukrainians, but also extends it for the Russians, and that they'll have to defend a lot more of their flanks, and so they'll have to probably also expand on the flanks a little bit to make it a more flattened front line. And but even before that, if they even want to reach the southern part of Pokrovsk, and in terms of this bet that's being talked about, if the bet's to just reach Pokrovsk and the battle for Pokrovsk itself begins, there's the 3 towns we need to talk about is Gordivka, Novy-Gorivka, and Selidova, which we've been talking about. And if we look at right now, they've been trying to right now, the battles along the rail lines have been for like these little villages with a couple hundred people at most. Now, these 3 towns have a couple thousand people, and actually have like, especially if you look at Novy-Gorivka, which is the next big town on the way to on the highway. They have a bunch of high-rise buildings. They have a bunch of better, the Ukrainians have a lot of better defense. Now, the Russians have improved, as we talked about earlier in this discussion, using fabs to try to demolish these high-rise buildings. But again, it will take, it took them about 3 weeks to go from Porez to reaching the outskirts of this town. And so, that in terms of the gains that we've seen in this war, that's actually a pretty big advance. However, now there is it all depends on how, obviously we're just casual observers. We're not on the ground. We're not like people who know the exact 100% information on like the state of the Ukrainian military. So like, how extensive is the Ukrainian manpower source? Because obviously these defenses are pretty strong. Also, and then in Selidova, we could see these 2 terracons, and a terracon's like a giant waste heap, which basically acts as, like, as we see in this where Charlemagne's kind of like zooming in right now.
High
It's kind of
ground.
like like a natural high ground that overlooks the entire steppe, and this also gives natural advantages to the defender. And Selidova itself also has some high-rise buildings, but these three towns basically help like kind of, and the thing is, if you want to like outflank these towns, you kind of get in the way of, if they want to cut off Novigorivka from the south, there's a bunch of these Terragons from Selidova that overlook, if the Russians wanted to try to take, say, Makarovka right there, but then they'll be obviously overlooked by the Ukrainians. So they kind of naturally defend each other. And that's actually why the main Ukrainian defense line in Donbass is, I call it the STD line, the Slavyansk-Toretsk line. And and the reason why it's like the main defense line, because it interconnects basically the most major city Donbass as almost a completely connected defense line that can basically like interconnects with, and kind of this is like in a smaller scale with these three towns. So and what I envision happening is that the weakest Rivka to the north here, which doesn't, I think has like one or two like 2-story buildings in the center, but doesn't have like a giant like citadel structure like the others. And the Russians will probably be able to take this town pretty a lot more easier than the other two, and from that they'll be able to take Novigorivka from the north and kind of improve upon, kind of do the modus operandi that they've been using, tactical grinds that slowly improve the positioning of their front line, which basically collapses the natural defense. It forces the Ukrainians to fall back. So like as we see with this line right here, the Russians are trying to get to the back of Novigorivka, and then that way they and that only could happen because they've been able to enter Gordivka. So depending on how fast they're able to break through these three towns, and we have to see, obviously we don't know the extent of, maybe the Ukrainian manpower is so short that, these defenses, which naturally, if they actually, because this is the tragedy of the Ukrainians in Kursk, is that if they just deployed one or two of their strategic brigades that they've been using there with their, like all these Western weapons, they could have pulled the Russians off here for at least another month, maybe month or two before they could reach Pokrovsk. But now, because they basically use their strategic reserves in Kursk, they're not going to be able to plug the gaps as easily, but depends on how exhausted Ukrainian manpower is. But there's still a lot of natural defenses that lead to Pokrovsk. But if they're able to overcome easily, let's say by September, then it's basically almost guaranteed they'll be able to reach Pokrovsk by the election.
Okay, so on the manpower front, there is a couple things to say. So we have several developments since the last time we streamed. The first is that Ukraine has allowed for the voluntary service of convicts. So that there's a 30,000 man number that's been floating around. Russia did this notably very early on with Wagner PMC, and that was very much frowned upon by NATO commentators. There's one big difference with this, is that now Ukraine is more towards the bottom of the barrel, where they haven't had to do this little tactic of using convict soldiery before, whereas Russia thinks differently than a NATO or a Western power, and they have no problem using convict volunteers very early on in the conflict. This is a doctrinal difference that NATO and Russia has. Russia likes to use its lowest quality assets at the beginning of a conflict. That's true for equipment, and that's true for personnel as well, it seems. And so if you're talking on a societal level, well, I'm using the lowest quality members of Russian society against you militarily, and then my highest quality troops are going to come into the fight a little bit like once the conflict is in a decisive phase. Whereas NATO kind of does the opposite, where they like to go hard and go heavy at the beginning of a conflict, to use their best equipment and their best personnel at the beginning, and then they tend to decrease in quality over time, it seems. And so this is what Ukraine is doing, basically, is the Russians have already used their worst and tried their worst of their society against Ukraine. Ukraine is now forced to rely on their worst of their society. And the second update is that the Ukrainians have lowered the minimum or the maximum draft age. That used to be 27. They have lowered that age to 25. If you look at Ukrainian demographics maps from a couple years ago and you scale up to 2024, you will notice that the age groups that are now between ages 25 and 27 are about, on the men side of the equation, not the female side of the equation, that's about a couple 100,000 men each for 25 and 26-year-old Ukrainians. So that's a grand total of 400,000 men, assuming that that's total 400,000 men total.
Is that pre or post them fleeing the country?
That is pre-war figures.
Okay, so we don't, because that's theoretical, because a lot of them have fled, and a fair number of people are in areas occupied by Russia.
Yes, I understand that, but this is a ballpark number, and
no, I know. I'm just saying for the audience.
Yes, yes. This is a maximum number that they could possibly draw from, so that we have a ballpark figure when calculating how long it's going to take for the Ukrainians to A, mobilize this manpower, and B, how long it's going to take for the Russians to attrite the Ukrainian new blood. So yes, about 400,000 men that Ukraine can now draw from. So this gets into long-term strategy and demographics planning. Ukraine, similar to Russia, increases in its long-term demographics pyramid below the age of 18, and especially below the age of 20. The longer this conflict goes on, the more manpower that Ukrainian forces can draw upon. However, that's also true for the Russians as well.
Okay, yes. So it's suggested that we now talk about the TND line, which this is it. Let's draw it. The TND line: New York, Druzhba, Toretsk. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting development since
that works
since our last stream.
But yeah, well, this ties into everything going on around Okrotine, because taking Okrotine and pressuring here. And then, breaking through to New York. I mean, the entire Donetsk front for the Ukrainians is just a disaster right now. But this is extremely significant. Let me actually bring up the Syriac map here, because we can see the front lines from the beginning of the war. So you can see how the Russians have now breached one of the last parts of the 2014 front line by going from Novoselika here, or Selavica, whatever, and getting to New York. And they've basically taken all of New York at this point. They've also broken through this part of the front line to Druzhba and are now basically on Toretsk. So in terms of the TND line, only the T is actually remaining. And this will probably be a bit more difficult for the Russians to take. But, similar to Avdiivka, where they breached the 2014 lines, they've now done it here as well. And this has been a very stagnant front for the entirety of the war, and now it has breached too. So we may see some really interesting activity here. And obviously everything going on around Pokrovsk and this highway right here plays into cutting off Konstantinivka from supply, except from, the rear. And, this also ties into the Russians taking the eastern part of Chasiv Yar, and fighting a bit across the canal here. They're clearly operationally setting up, to take Konstantinivka. All of this just plays into the larger operational goal of the sort of main front line, or the main line in Donetsk, which has always been Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Konstantinivka. So yeah,
it all kind of interconnects with each other. Talked about it earlier, but like all these, again, if you look at it from the strategic point of view, obviously the Russians are focusing on trying to take Donbass, and as we mentioned, the main Donbass front line is the STD line, which you mentioned earlier here. And now here's how it all connects. So Chasiv Yar, if we look back at that geography lab, Chasiv Yar is the dominant height in the overlooking the entire front. So the Slavyansk Toretsk line, the STD line, is the main defense for the Ukrainians. And the Russians take Chasiv Yar, this will give them the height advantage overlooking the entire line. Very bad for the Ukrainians. And that's actually why it's been so tough for the Russians to take Chasiv Yar, because going from Bakhmut to Chasiv Yar has basically been a continuous uphill battle. And so if you like kind of like scroll up, you can see Bakhmut on the on the eastern side, and then as you go more to the left, you could see if you scroll up, you could see that the Slavyansk-Toretsk line is more on the low ground here, and so that's why Chasiv Yar is important. And then when we look at the Russian pushes in the Kupiansk-Liman, up in the north, that's more of a second. The Russians are pushing everywhere to pin Ukrainian units, because if the Russians didn't push, say, in Zaporozhye, then the Ukrainians could redeploy units from there to more critical sectors. But besides that, the Russians are going to try to outflank the Slavyansk-Toretsk line from the north by trying to reach the Oskil River. That's why they're trying to push in Kupiansk. And if we see the push in Pokrovsk, one of the main purposes of that originally was actually to push the Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk, because the Ukrainians were shelling Donetsk like very indiscriminately, and basically they've been able to push conventional Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk with their offensives in this year. But also the push in Pokrovsk, if you look, is that it's the major supply node for Western Donbass, and it's like kind of the supply node for that main defense. And then as we look at the fight for Toretsk, is that if Toretsk falls, they could like unlinch, because if you get behind this line, then kind of like as the Russians were able to advance behind the Vochachka River, it kind of unhinges, because the Ukrainians are expecting a direct attack from Chasiv Yar and have built their defenses with that in mind. But when you advance from Toretsk and then get behind them, the Ukrainians didn't build as much defenses in the expectation that you would be attacking from behind. And then also we're cutting off their supply by taking Pokrovsk. That would lead to a lot more it'd be a lot hard. They weren't expecting that, because they were expecting to hold the Russians in the pre-2014 defenses. And so all these are kind of interconnected with the main goal of reaching the Donbass, taking the Donbass. And the main question we have to ask ourselves is what's the peace going to look like? Because we obviously know what both sides want. Putin said he wants to have all 4 oblasts in their full administrative borders, and the Ukrainians obviously still are delusionally thinking they could get everything back. Now, the more likely scenario that the West is going to probably propose is that after the collapse of the 2023 offensive, is they realize they actually can't knock the Russians out. They actually got extremely bad lessons from why the Russians lost in 2022, which was because the Russians, as I mentioned, didn't show up. They didn't actually mobilize, while Ukraine did mobilize. They were able to basically overrun Russian positions in Kharkov, and they were able to cut off Russian positions in Kherson. And that's why they were able to, and they thought it was because the Russians were just completely unmotivated conscripts.
I think there's a recent article, it's behind a paywall, but they I think it was called "Western Weapons Work Until They Don't," where they expressed surprise that the Russians didn't act like the Iraqis in 2003.
Yeah, no, that's actually, if you look at that's actually, they were interviewing like a bunch of Ukrainian units that participated. They're like, the expectation, the planning was that, once we rolled up with Rat and our Leopards, that the Russian conscripts would just flee in terror, and then, they would collapse just like they did in Kharkov. But what happened was that at a retreat, because the line was so thinly manned, they were able to just ride around Russian defenses. And, so they thought they could do that again. But obviously, and it actually kind of happened in Kherson. A lot of people forgot about the Kherson offensive, but before the Russians gave up all, the Ukrainians gave very little ground in the Kherson offensive. It was almost like a prelude to the 2023 offensive, because they gained so little. Because when the Russians actually stand their ground and actually have proper manning, like the Ukrainians gained almost very little, and they learned that in 2023. So now what the West knows is that they're basically hoping to have a peace along current lines, and despite what a lot of people say, a ceasefire on current lines actually helps the Ukrainians and the West, because
absolutely, yeah,
and so that's why they want that. And the main question, a lot of more doomerish pro-Russian people say, is that they think Putin wants to just try to cuck out and sign a peace with current lines,
freeze the conflict.
Yeah, freeze the conflict. And obviously that, and despite, because he wants to sell basically the victory he has, and then just go back to where things were and kind of come back, have the sanctions lifted. But obviously the thing is, he's not a complete pushover. But as we mentioned, he's not like a conqueror. He doesn't actually want to annex Ukraine. He wants to bring Ukraine back to the Russian fold. But if not that, then he wants to basically secure certain pieces for them. And a lot of these things are unacceptable for Ukraine. One of the biggest things, and this is why I think a peace won't happen, is because one of the biggest things about this is Kherson. Because if Russia is given what it wants, it basically is given a strong bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper River, which is a tremendous strategic achievement. This is on par with like the land bridge with Crimea. Like having a strong bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper would be a complete, like, really be unacceptable for Ukraine. And obviously, also this happens a little bit in Zaporozhye, because I think Zaporozhye is divided by the river.
Yes,
but the thing is that Putin's basically asking Ukraine, like, hey, like Zaporozhye is a city of 700,000 people before the war. Like, what, basically Putin's like, give up that entire city and give us a right, give Putin a bunch of like strategic and make no mistake, even if a peace does happen or a ceasefire, there will be another war. Maybe in 5 years, a year, 10 years, but there'll be a war. It's not like they make a peace and then everyone's gonna be happy. There's gonna be bad blood on each side, and then each side's gonna want to reclaim what they want. And but again, a peace would help Ukraine more than it would help Russia. But that being said, that if they want peace, they were gonna have to, the Ukraine will have to give up a bunch of territory that it does not want to give up. And it would be completely disastrous for them. And so they're not going to give it up. And then, when the Russians finish in Donbass and they still aren't given the peace they want, they'll start advancing into Kharkov and the Dnieper region. And then, honestly, at that point, I think Russia would annex those regions, because it's like, well, because the main goal, again, was to get rid of the anti-Russian regime in Ukraine. But if that can't happen, then it's like, well, then we'll just take the territory from you, since we can't reach Kiev. And the thing is that if Putin was down to annex Kherson, which if you look at the voting record in the last Ukrainian election, Kherson was actually they voted for the pro-Russian person, but it was the lower vote than all the other oblasts in Novorossiya, and so
It's a swing state.
Yeah, basically. Well, kind of, yeah. And if he's down to annex Kherson, there's really Putin's not against annexing Kharkov and the Dnieper. I think he's like, if the Ukrainians accept my deal, I won't annex them. But obviously, it's a conundrum, because the West and the Ukraine does not want to give up, like, giving the Russians a right bank on the Dnieper. They don't want them to give up all of Donbass. And give them basically open road through the open steppe towards the Dnieper River. So it's there's a lot of and even now Russia's like thinking like, hey, another additional demand we might have is that we want to take at least 30 kilometers of the entire of Kharkov and Sumy, so that you guys can't shell the Russian borderlands anymore. And with this recent Kursk invasion, I'm pretty certain Putin's probably going to also demand some sort of probably border strip to prevent the Ukrainians from shelling Russian territory. So the more if the Ukraine, the best deal they could have got is what Putin's offering right now, and the only way they could basically is, this is the best deal they could get. And if the longer they wait, in a attrition war, the side with the most manpower and the most equipment wins. That's how the Western powers won in World War I. And this is how Russia's going to win in Ukraine. And obviously it's going to be slower, because obviously Ukraine's not by itself. It's fighting with the combined support of the entire collective West. But it's not like the entire collective West is putting its entire energy into helping Ukraine. It's giving them a bunch of weapons, money, and assistance. But it's not, even with that, it doesn't overcome how big a difference between Ukraine and Russia, the power differences. So in a long war, Ukraine loses, and that's why I think this is why the deal they have is the best deal they have.
Okay,
on this question, on the grand strategy question, is, well, this is how NATO NATO thinks that Russia is going to run out of artillery shells or at least armored vehicles by 2026, and that by 2026 that they will have begun building enough factories and artillery shell production that they will with U.S. Production as well as the rest of
European.
NATO artillery, European specifically artillery production, that they'll begin to close the gap in terms of the artillery disparity that Ukraine is suffering from. And they think with those two things together that the conflict will basically be frozen.
Sorry, just before we get into this, because I know what you're going to talk about, I just wanted to finish off the previous point. So I think that peace deal is no longer on the table because of the Kursk offensive. I think Putin basically said that, as have some other people. And B, I don't think this war is going to end probably without some sort of unconditional surrender, because Russia's number one priority, and I think this has been their priority since the beginning, is no NATO membership for Ukraine. And that is a hard red line. They will not give up on that. And I don't think the West will give up on NATO membership for Ukraine. So they've been saying like, oh, we're going to freeze the conflict, and now while the conflict frozen, Ukraine's going to join NATO, and then if they restart it, will trigger the defense pact or something like that. So I think the more they say that, the less likely it is that Russia is going to accept it. I just don't think there could be any peace treaty that doesn't include a pledge from Ukraine to never join NATO.
No, Arjun, I think you made a really good point, and you mentioned exactly that Putin, for the first time in the entire war, has said we are not negotiating anymore. There's like I think his literal words were, we have nothing to talk about with them. So I mean, you can I'm sure we've all been cynical about Putin's intentions to negotiate with the Ukrainians. You're like, this is just like diplomatic cover. It's like Russia is always open to negotiation. The Ukrainians can always come to the table whenever they want. They just refuse to. The problem is on the other side. This is very
right,
deep,
because
deep
Russia's position has always been, you just give us the 4 oblasts, and as we've seen from the map I've been showing, like that's a significant amount of territory the Russians haven't fought through.
Well, at this part, or it's changed throughout the war, depending how the situation on the ground is going. But the thing that's never changed and never will change is NATO membership.
Yeah,
yes,
but
I agree.
Like you said, I think now Putin has. I mean, this is going to be in the history books and the diplomatic record. This is when Putin said we are no longer negotiating. This will be a fight to the death. Whoever collapses first.
One thing is, I agree with you. In fact, there's in the chat here about how, from the Washington Post, about how there was actually a secret deal that they were trying to they were negotiating. It was specifically going to start talking about how the Russian, like some deal where the Russians will stop striking Ukrainian energy production, and the Ukrainians will stop striking Russian oil refineries. But the hope was that it would lead to a ceasefire talk. But now the Post is kind of talking about how they gave, after the Kursk offensive, they basically got blown away, which is kind of backfire, because according to what Ukrainians say, is like the whole purpose of this Kursk offensive was to basically get a bargaining chip for future negotiations. And from what I've read, it looks like they're like, hey, instead of ceasefire on current lines, if we'll give up Kursk if you return back to the pre-2022 front lines or something. And so like that was like the hope, because otherwise they would have just sat in the trenches and just got glide bombed and artillery shelled to death until the Russians just slowly grinded forward. And obviously they needed to shake things up. But the one thing is that, so yeah, you guys make a good point that like, I think that Putin wanted a peace, and he has his demands. But I think now that with this Kursk incursion, like every time like he gives like a what's the right word, a peace offering, he gets spit in his face. And he Zelensky basically says, no, we're not going to like negotiate with you. We're going to continue fighting. So if Zelensky, it's actually kind of Zelensky that's been prolonging this war, because without him, or without the Ukrainian government,
he passed the decree that they can't negotiate with Russia.
Yeah.
I think Ukraine technically can't. Just another thing to keep in mind is, even if, let's pretend Putin's a psychopath and he doesn't care, it's important to Russia's allies that he attempt to, like it's important to China. And what happened a week before the Kursk thing is Ukraine's foreign minister went to China and talked to the Chinese and tried to get them like to talk about mediating. And China was like, okay, maybe we can do something. And then they launched Kursk. And China's pretty angry. But I think a lot of this is Putin's playing to the audience, wherein he doesn't really expect them to negotiate, but so long as he says that, it gives cover for China and India and his other friends to not sanction him.
I think it's also important to note here as well that Zelensky refused to hold elections this year, which they were due, and Ukraine did not hold elections. So even from an international perspective, you can't say that Zelensky is technically, a truly legitimate head of state at this point.
When Putin said as much, he said after that we don't recognize Zelensky and we're not negotiating with him. So that's already on the table even before Kursk, is that Zelensky's not a legitimate representative and we won't negotiate with him. It has to be someone else. The Ukraine has to hold elections, basically.
Correct.
Do we want to get into the shell production article?
Yep, sure. Sorry, I just wanted to cover that because
it's been a really good conversation, but just in the interest of continuing on, and we can talk more about this when we get to Kursk. But yeah, shell production, Mandrill.
Okay. Well, let's see. You can see the graph in front of you. U.S. shell production has been not where it should be. This is part of the failure of the West to maintain its industrial capacity over the last 30 or 40 years. And now things have really come home to roost. What happens if you have active, ongoing conventional conflicts that directly follow a long-term guerrilla warfare or asymmetrical warfare, I should say, in the Middle East, where you are still using artillery shells? Well, you're going to draw down your stocks a little bit, and whatever surplus we had was probably given to the Ukrainians at the start of the conflict. I would imagine that mostly what is happening now, we're giving monthly production or whatever we can spare from our monthly production. The 155 millimeter shells, we had one factory at the start of the war that was producing this particular shell. It was at 50% production capacity. It was making 14,000 a month. They have spun up that factory to make its full capacity of 28,000. They are increasing the production with another factory that they have tried to create. That's, I think, supposed to be done by the end of 2024, early 2025, maybe. They've really expedited it. And then there's a third one that they're increasing as well. And so you can see that 28,000 multiplied by 3, okay, then you add that up by a year. That's basically 1 million shells, right? So you have about a million shells a year essentially to play with once these factories are done. And this is why I say that the West is essentially, they need a break so that they can bring their production capacity online and rearm Ukraine. But they also think that Russia is going to attrite itself and its armored vehicles and exhaust its artillery stockpile by the end of 2026. And that's why I was saying that they think that they can close this artillery disparity, right? So this is the brass tacks of the numbers and the breakdown of the numbers here. There's been other additional problems as well. The biggest one and the most notable one is the lack of primers, right? So there has been in keeping with green energy policy, they're trying to make a more friendly primer that isn't TNT. That's more expensive, and they have had significant problems with that. And I think
they've shut down all TNT production in the U.S.
Yes, they had. We were basically shut down for a year and 3 months, basically for primers.
I think there is just the one place in Poland. Sorry, this whole thing is the most. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so you're talking about the factory in Poland. There is one in Poland, and there was one in eastern Ukraine as well, which the Russians captured pretty soon after the start of the war. So you outsourced all of your TNT production and all of your primer production, and now you don't have the shells, and you don't have the necessary primers for the shells in the first place. So it's just a whole dog's breakfast, basically. And this is true across all of NATO, I would imagine. Deindustrialization has been a disaster, and now it's really coming home to roost in the foreign policy and international relations geopol arena. This is bad for NATO. This is bad for the United States geopolitically.
100%. And Mandro, did you hear that story about I believe it was a Scranton plant, the 155 millimeter plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This was I believe 3 months ago. It was all over Twitter. There was a huge fire that the plant caught fire. It was obviously it was a manufacturing malfunction, and it was all over Twitter for a significant amount of time. These are very old plants. There have been multiple stories about they're having to rehire employees of these factories that haven't worked in the past 25 years, and they're all in their 60s at this point. It's the deindustrialization is happening right before our eyes, and they're just trying to kickstart it, kicking and screaming.
The deindustrialization already happened. What they're trying to do is they're trying to reindustrialize, and that's going to take time, effort, resources that they don't want to allocate to it, and that they'd rather put in other places.
So, personally, I just want to suggest everyone watching this to go read this article, because this is one of the most insane things I've ever read.
Oh, yes.
Perfectly honest. It is. But how do we get to that? Is our leadership just this stupid? Did they just not think ahead? It's just
no. This is malicious. Even the article says people in the higher echelons were told that this was a problem, and they basically ignored this. So this makes me think that this is kind of malicious. This is intentional. There's no way that you could draw down your production of not just artillery munitions and TNT, but also of your steel and your aluminum and nuclear power and all of this stuff without doing this intentionally.
Isn't there also a massive gunpowder shortage? I think the article talks about that too.
It does, yeah. That's
propellant for the shells.
Oh yeah, I did touch on that. Okay, yeah.
And people think we have a military-industrial complex.
It's just the It hurts my head to think that they're no, we're okay with this one random plant in Poland. I mean, if they go to war with Russia, Russia could just hit it with one Iskander, and then NATO can't produce any more TNT. And no one thought this was a bad. Either they're just really that stupid, which, given who we're run by, I could see that, or it's some sort of deliberate thing. But it's really scary that they can't produce gunpowder and they can't produce TNT. Those are the two most fundamental things, along with steel.
Yeah. Well, yeah, looking at what I've been highlighting, there's basically the one TNT plant in Poland. All the Western countries are shutting down. Same with gunpowder. There's one gunpowder plant in rural Virginia, and it's apparently breaking down, and they're trying to replace that too. So it's if a war did happen between great powers, these would be hit with hypersonic missiles, and then what? Now you have no gunpowder.
I think it says the plant in Poland is out of date and over capacity and can explode at any time, or something. It's
the equipment.
It's insane. Yeah,
the equipment at the Scranton plant is 70 years old. I mean, they haven't updated anything.
So do you think it's just arrogance that they just figured it's a combination of greed and arrogance? It's not cost. It doesn't make us money to produce bullets or shells or stuff like that. We need to produce more of these wonder weapons, and our wonder weapons are so good that we'll just be able to immediately just blow out anybody we're up against. So we don't have to worry about the fundamentals.
I can speak to this. Basically, correct. Yes, they think that precision guided munitions were the be all end all and were the future of warfare, and so we don't need to invest in conventional dumb munitions whatsoever. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a degree of arrogance that you can't. I mean, let's put it this way, right? U.S. Steel was being bought out by a Japanese firm, right? United States Steel, right? that's in Pennsylvania, right? You're making you need a steel company that's in Pennsylvania because it's right next to the anthracite coal deposits, and that's really easy to transfer them by rail to make very, very specific, like high grade steel using that anthracite coal. It's just mind boggling that the lack of a willingness to plan and to take any sort of material resource considerations like into account is just flabbergasting. Like it's at every level, right?
But
Every
you can't
single
even
thing.
make small arms ammo without gunpowder. Or is there like some conspiracy that this is to try to undermine the Second Amendment and make
Like
bullets?
it has to be malicious. Like there's no way you could let all of this stuff go all at once and not like think that this was intentional.
One thing I would add, I would kind of want to add to this discussion is that, the old saying that like generals, try to prepare for the next war by analyzing like the last war, however the hell the saying is. But like what the idea was that like in a future conflict, artillery shell, if everyone was like polled like, hey, before Russia's going to invade Ukraine, how do you think it's going to look like? People would have expected, some sort of like, big mobile offensive, big encirclements, the war would have been over within a few, very quickly. And thus, you didn't need, but if you ask like, actually, that doesn't happen, what do you think is actually going to happen? I don't think a lot of people would have expected like, oh yeah, it's going to become like a World War I, war where basically the front line barely moves. And there's like any offensive takes a few months to maybe take a major supply city of 60,000 people. It's like, if that's what's, in order to do that, you're going to need a ton of artillery because you need a, you're basically in this positional attritional battle. No one expected that a war would be like that. They thought, in a great, any war would be just, maneuverable warfare that would have been over within a few months. And that way they didn't actually have to scale up and actually stockpile.
Well, no, I get that, and I understand if they reduced the total amount of capacity because the Cold War was over. But even then, you still need, I don't know, is that the explosive? Do they use TNT in tank shells? You still need explosives for tank shells. You still need the actual explosive for the like the TACMs. You still need gunpowder for small arms. I could see it decreasing. It just seems really weird. Someone points out that they shut down the lead smelting plants in the U.S. So some people think this might have been to try to make it harder for Americans to get ammo. In part, I don't know.
There's an article about this alternative explosive called IMX 101, which is more environmentally friendly. Great reason.
This is the green ammo I was referencing earlier.
Green ammo.
Well, I'm okay with replacing TNT, but shouldn't you make sure that works before you close the TNT plant?
The problem is it's more expensive than TNT. That's the issue. It's like everything that these people make is always like more expensive. You never have enough. Like the late stage Soviet vibes of America is just it's yeah, God.
Wouldn't logic be like, okay, we'll get the new stuff up and running, we'll make sure it works, and then we'll close the TNT plant? They're just
it's the same story with the all deindustrialization efforts, right? It's like build windmills and solar panels and don't build a nuclear energy, and we're just gonna not build enough resources based on like the idea that we're gonna switch. It'd be like if you like you were building a new house, right? And to like build your new house, you like disassembled your old house to get the pieces for it. And it's like, well, maybe you still need a house to live in like before. Yeah. Anyway.
No, dude, that's a lot more logical. This would be you like burn down your old house and then start building a new one.
Yes.
Because then you would actually be like economically reusing things.
Yeah, you're right. So I don't do any more to say on this article. It's really long and definitely recommend reading the article. I linked it in chat. But we're ready to get to Kharkov and Kursk now.
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Very good. So we'll go back to this map. I know, Hunger, you wanted to talk about Kharkov. Interesting. I mean, the Russians have actually been in the Kharkov Oblast, the whole time. We talk about this Kharkov offensive. Obviously, they were deep in there when they were pushed out in the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2022. We can see here in yellow is the Luhansk, and like red-orange is the Donetsk Oblast. So here we can see the Russians have been in Kharkov and are penetrating Kharkov and other places too. But obviously, we mean to talk about this offensive just south of Belgorod. I will go switch to the deep state UA map where I can draw lines now. So yeah, you take it away.
Yeah, so I just want to take credit. I was partially right on my bet. I predicted there would be an offensive in the Kharkov region. So if you go back to March and April, everyone was talking about Belgorod was being shelled. There were many cross-border raids being done by Ukrainian DRG units. They would cross the border. They would terrorize civilians in the border regions, and there's a huge incident where I believe it was a HIMARS strike. The Ukrainians launched HIMARS missiles at Belgorod, and they killed about a dozen people, including some children. And so this was obviously a huge provocation. It was like Belgorod was being shelled quite badly in the preceding months. So this operation that just happened, this happened on the 10th of May, and the Russians before May, the Russians had been for the past few months been concentrating some troops in this region. There was an estimated about 15,000 troops in Belgorod Oblast, and no one was entirely sure when there would be an incursion into Kharkov Oblast, but everyone knew it. Everyone knew it was going to happen. No one knew when, and no one knew from what direction. It happened directly. It happened directly south of Belgorod. Sorry, I'm going to confuse Kharkov and Belgorod a lot. So on the 10th of May, the Russians fired a massive artillery barrage onto the Ukrainian border regions and border posts, and very quickly, within the first week, overran the border crossings and took, I wouldn't say an insignificant amount of territory. It was about, I would say they penetrated about 10 kilometers or 12 kilometers deep into Kharkov Oblast over the first week of the offensive. But I mean, it slowed. After that, there was very heavy fighting. The Russians did not really advance south of two major cities in Kharkov Oblast, which was, one of them was Lipsy, which is on the western side, and the other city is Vovchansk, which is on the right side, right there. Yeah. So that's Lipsy. They're on the outskirts of Lipsy right now. They've been stuck in these positions for the past 2 months. There's been almost no movement on this side of the offensive since the middle of June, basically. And on this side, similar story, but much more intense fighting. There are much more Russian troops on this side of the front, and Vovchansk is an important strategic city. It's a good logistics base. It's got decent road access to all of these places. It opens up the road further south down the Donetsk River. You see that on the left, right there. And I thought they would advance much further, because I thought this operation from Vovchansk would support their Luhansk front operation. You see Kupiansk, like the Kharkov and the Kupiansk fronts are very interconnected, and I thought this my prediction for my bet would be an offensive in Kharkov would help, Russia's right shoulder, the Luhansk front, and the capture of Kupiansk. But that hasn't happened yet. They've been stuck in Vovchansk. They control about half of this. They control about half of the city north of the river. It's the Vovcha River. So Vovchansk is divided in two by the river, and the Russians control about half of the river on the northern side. There's been a giant Ukrainian pocket there since the middle of June. The Russians have been trying to drive them out, sometimes successfully, sometimes the Ukrainians counterattack, and they're still there. Interesting little tidbit about that. You see that little red dot in the middle, right on the river. There was a huge media story months ago that the Ukrainians had encircled like 400 Russian troops in that area. I mean, this is deep state, so it's a pro-Ukrainian map. And NAFO Twitter and Ukraine Twitter were, orgasming over the fact that hundreds of troops were trapped in this little encirclement. There's no evidence to confirm this, and what the internet does. 400 becomes 4,000, and 4,000 becomes, like, I don't know, 40,000, and like there's thousands of these troops trapped on the northern side of Vovchka being encircled. There's no evidence of that happening, but this was a much less dramatic invasion than everyone thought it would be. I personally thought it would be much more significant in helping the Kupiansk front. And the Russians have done some advances in the Kupiansk front. It's not nothing, but they have not gotten very far. It's basically stalled since the end of June. They did capture a very important place, which was Pishchane. Pishchane is right there. That was a very important town they captured. And the other significant action in this area was they finally broke through Sinkivka. So they finally entered Sinkivka. They've been bashing their head against Sinkivka for over a year now. The Russian commander in this area has been replaced twice from the failures of like these head-on advances the Russians would take into Sinkivka. This is a very dangerous position for the Ukrainians right now. There's a giant regiment, trapped on the eastern bank of the Oskol River, but they have not been able to cut them off or dislodge them. I mean, all that bridge in Kupiansk has been completely wiped out. The Ukrainians are using pontoon bridges for resupply, and the advance out of Pishchane has not reached the river yet. So they could theoretically cut this front into two, but they have not been able to do that yet through that salient in Pishchane.
I actually want to say I actually agreed with you if you told me before that like where the main Russian attack would be, like I would have actually guessed in like Kharkov or something, or in like the Kupiansk area, because again it kind of also, as we mentioned, also gets to the north, and it could cut the main Ukrainian defense line in Donbass from the north, kind of like what they did in 2022. So I actually had the same opinions. I thought when the Kharkov offensive happened that they were going to try to like link up with the Kupiansk front, and the reason why that's and kind of basically retake the lands they lost in 2022, and the reason why that actually would also work is that it would actually not really extend the front line, and it also gives them the natural defense with the Seversky Donetsk River, so there's the Oskol River, which is the first, but then there's also the Seversky Donetsk River, which is goes to the west of Volchansk and then goes down. And basically, you're just kind of extending the front that is currently is in Luhansk all the way to the west along the river. And so you don't really extend the front line. And you also have, if you attack from Volchansk, you have the chance, as Hungary mentioned, that you could outflank the Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk, and then also and take a bunch of land. Offensive, we don't know the exact. There's like three purposes for the Kharkov offensive, and they kind of it depends on like I think it would have depended on how successful they are, and basically how successful they could have penetrated. But it looks like the Ukrainians basically sent a bunch of their reserves here. That's actually why they finally gave up on Krinky. They sent their Marines to the Volchansk area. They've been spotted there, and they basically sent a bunch of the reserves that they weren't making it for their Kursk offensive to Kharkov. And so in terms of actually trying to cut off Kupiansk, obviously that didn't happen because the Ukrainians basically held the Russians at the first major, like all the border villages were taken, but they were kind of in the gray zone anyway, because obviously you're right on the border, so you can't just like have the defenses there weren't as good. But once they reached the first major town, Volchansk and Lipsy, they actually started getting a bunch of resistance. And also Volchansk has like a high-rise citadel in the northern area. That's what's being fought over for these last few months. And so the secondary acts. So if they couldn't like try to cut off the Ukrainians in Kupiansk, the second thing was to creating a border zone. And Putin actually mentioned that he's like we might have to go back into Kharkov and create a buffer zone so that they could stop shelling Belgorod. And obviously so that doesn't require as much rapid advance, but obviously that also because they haven't pushed deep enough that would have stopped completely the Ukrainian shelling of Belgorod. So the secondary purpose of the Russian Kharkov offensive has basically not been achieved. However, one thing that also has been mentioned is that it drags Ukrainian reserves away from Donbass, and because the way the Ukrainians have been able to stop the Russian offensive is that they would put a unit on the front line. The Russians would have to take a few weeks to like shell and bomb that unit into oblivion. And then after that unit gets rotated out, it gets replaced with another batch of new conscripts or another unit that's been in the back. However, all those reserves that were waiting in the back were sent to Kharkov. And so they weren't able to readily replace the units holding the front line in Donbass. And so in terms of that, that's actually been successful for the Russians because they've been able to open up another front and thin out the Ukrainian units. And
it was very successful. Sorry, yeah. It was very successful in the attrition aspect. It increased the pace of attrition on the Ukrainian side because of those reserves. Operationally, what was the territorial or strategic outlook? We'll never really know. We don't really have an answer for that. But you should also mention, we should also mention that it was only about 15,000 troops that were involved in the entire operation. Like that, in all honesty, that's not much. Like this was a very underwhelming offensive. They did establish a very minor cordon sanitaire. They did not capture a major town or city in this region, but it wasn't complete. It wasn't a complete waste of time on the Russian side because it was a very small investment of 15,000 men. Most of those in reserve.
Ukraine to move a bunch of guys around.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I would, and this kind of goes into the Kursk. We'll talk about this in the Kursk discussion, I guess. But the Ukrainians are also like, well, the reason why we went to Kursk is to drag Russian reserves from Donbass there. The thing is that Russia actually has a bunch of units that they're not using in Ukraine that they can use now that the war has come to Russia proper. They have literally like 100 and something thousand conscripts that they have refused to deploy to Ukraine that are just kind of sitting around military bases that they could use. Now a bunch of them got overran in the original when the Ukrainians originally came in, but they have a bunch of troops that they could use to at least hold the front there. They don't need to drag troops from Donbass. And the other thing is that they have a bunch of National Guard units they have that they've been using that aren't deployed as much in Ukraine. And so the thing is that in terms of the aspect of opening up another front to drag reserves, it worked for the Russians in Kharkov because the Ukrainians didn't have fresh, they didn't have just because you opened Kharkov doesn't mean you have new reserves that you weren't going to use anyway. Russia has that, so that's why they didn't actually have to slow down operations in Donbass for Kursk, but the Ukrainians had to thin out their lines to help save off to hold off the Russians in Kharkov.
I think just before as we get into Kursk, it's important to keep in mind that I think at this point in the war, Ukraine used up the last of its strategic reserves in Avdiivka. So they don't have any in the rear. Any soldiers that they put into a particular position, they have to pull out of somewhere else. Whereas Russia still has a bunch. So for Kharkov, I think they were able to just send in some of their reserve units or units that were just coming online. Whereas in order to counter that, and we see this in Kursk as well, Ukraine has to pull them off of ongoing battles.
And one thing I also want to mention, you mentioned Hungary, you mentioned about how this was just 15,000 troops. And this also kind of goes to the Kursk discussion. But one person made a very good, not in this discussion, but someone made a good point that this is a war of ants in the sense that we might, a lot of people say there's hundreds of thousands of troops, and there is, but there might not be as much as we think there is. Because if we look at the way offensive operations have been done in this war, it's a couple thousand people, maybe as you mentioned, the Kharkov offensive used 15,000 troops. The Ukrainians in Kursk, from what I've read, are 10,000 or something troops. When we see the Russians try to attack a position in in Donbass, the Russians use maybe a dozen or two troops to attack a position with maybe one or two, with a tank and maybe two or three, infantry fighting vehicles. So it's there's not as much as we saw with Kursk. The Russians had to scramble. There wasn't just a bunch of Russian troops guarding Kursk. It got overrun pretty quick. And that kind of spills into how big is actually the Russian and Ukrainian armies. A lot of people say there's hundreds of thousands, but the way this battle, the battles are being fought is with a couple hundred troops, and then in the larger strategic sense, only a couple thousand. While as when we saw in World War I or World War II, the type of battles we saw with the similar amount of frontline coverage is with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops. And one thing I want to mention with Russia has gone a bunch of troops with its volunteer contract system. That is true. But one thing I would also mention is that a lot of pro-Russian sources point to the Ukrainians themselves saying the Russians have a bunch of recruitment. But that's one thing I want to mention is that a lot of those contract numbers can be a bit inflated because a bunch of those new Russian contracts were from former Donbass units. It's actually not a stretch to say that in the early months of the war in 2022 in Donbass, that the majority of fighting was being done by the Donbass militias and not by the professional Russian army. And so a bunch of these new contracts aren't necessarily new troops that are fighting for Russia, but like troops who are already fighting for Russia were now moving from being part of like the Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republics militias to actually being full-fledged contract members. So the amount of troops they kind of pull out, 200, 300,000 new troops, I think Putin said, is not all of them are fresh troops. And also Ukraine has a bit of a reason to inflate that because according to the Ukrainians, they're inflicting 30,000 Russian dead every month, 30,000
every week.
Yeah, yeah, it's and so they're like, okay, if the Russians are losing 30,000 troops, like very very fast, like how are they still advancing? Like, well, actually, because they're contracting that many people every time, the amount of times they lose that. So
Human waves.
Yeah, and human wave attacks, and so and then also with the Ukraine and Russia, I think there's not as much troops as we think there is, and that's why I think this is a war of ants, basically. Like we see any big offensive is with like a couple thousand troops at the very most, not like not enough to have any sort of actually big breakthrough. So I think that's might explain why we see the slow gains that we see and then when the initial surprise is over, we see it back to a positional grinding offensive.
Yeah, and that appears to be what's happening in Kursk. So I know, Argent, you were going to talk about this one a bit. Do you want to go describe what's happening?
Sure. Okay, so I'm just going to say off the bat, there's a lot of fog of war. Now, so Alexander Mercurius of the Duran has his source, who's generally reliable. But the claim is that this whole thing was actually partially a Russian plan to lure the Ukrainians into a trap. So I don't know if that's true or not. What I think happened is the Ukrainians needed a W. They needed a morale boost. And they looked around and they noticed that the area in Kursk was rather lightly defended. So they managed to just kind of pull together like a ragtag group of units from all across the front line and just kind of launched a limited offensive into Kursk. Now, people think that the goal was to take the Kursk nuclear power plant and to use that as a bargaining chip, either to get the Kherson nuclear power plant back or to as some sort of land swap in a future negotiation. So they just kind of came in, and I don't think there was very much in the area. So they were able to overrun a bunch of ground really quickly. And this is kind of where we start to get into the fog of war. Because as with, and you can even see it on this map, early in the war, you had all the territory Russia supposedly occupied. But if you look at it, it's just the roads. Like it's literally just the territory Russia drove along to get to major cities. Yeah, you can see it there, like in Sumy and Kharkov, all over the place. So did Russia actually control that? Not exactly. And I think that's probably what's happening in Kursk, where they've taken maybe a couple tiny settlements. They claim it's like 70, but some of these things aren't even on the map. So they have presence in these areas, and they're saying they control it because they have presence in this area. Now, once again, this is from pro-Russian side, but they claim some of the settlements Ukraine claims to capture is Ukraine is sending like a couple armored vehicles there. They take a picture, they announce it's captured, and then they keep moving. But after kind of the initial surprise or whatever, Russia's been just redeploying a whole bunch of reserves. I think that there might have been plans for a larger offensive on Russia's part. So there were some units fairly close by. But the problem that Ukraine is coming across is as with a lot of things in this war, PR is really important. And if they kind of withdraw at this point, it's going to look bad. And they've taken pretty heavy casualties. So they're just kind of doubling down and tripling down. Like I said earlier, Ukraine really doesn't have any strategic reserves yet. So they're having to pull troops off of Chasiv Yar or all the other really important battles in the south to to try to reinforce this position, even as Russia has not really had to redeploy any troops. So it's kind of up in the air what exactly is going on. But in my opinion, I think this is like a PR thing or a morale thing. It might even just be a way of scuttling any potential negotiations, maybe to give Kamala a boost heading into the election. I think it might take Russia a little while to kick them out, but I don't really think it's going to strategically impact the war on the whole. It is deeply embarrassing, though, and ironically, embarrassing Putin may not be a good idea because that means he's not going to negotiate.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point on the reasons why the Ukrainians entered Kursk in the first place. I think that it's required as a change in narrative in a similar fashion to what was going on at Krinky. I think that they needed to flip the script a little bit and needed to do some offensive action. Right, you have to keep Ukraine in the eyes of the average Westerner as the current thing, right? Ukraine has a very vested interest because it is entirely reliant on Western arms, ammunition, supplies, money, etc., everything. So you can never allow the West to focus on something else. You always have to have them paying attention to you, which means that's at a strategic level. And so at the tactical and operational level, it seems that Ukraine, their goals are not exactly aligned here. They're more than willing to take tactical losses or make operationally less sound decisions in order to keep the West paying attention. So for me, that's why I think that they did this offensive. The alternative would have been to keep these units near Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar or wherever the heck they were as a reserve and allow the Russians to slowly grind through all of that, consistently losing village after village, which is a totally different narrative, right? That's boring, right? Losing slowly over time is a lot more boring, and it gives the message that, okay, the outcome of this conflict has been determined. It's just a matter of time. And so that's partially why I would imagine the Ukrainians have advanced near Kursk.
They needed a major release. The other films were stuck in development hell, so they decided to throw one out there.
I can steel man the Kursk offensive a bit more than that. I think. I mean, like you just said, the story of 2023 is Ukraine losing everywhere. The counteroffensive failed, and now the Russians have broken through to the point that even zoomed out, you can actually see changes in the map here. And the Russians are taking territory in the Lugansk. They're taking territory in Donetsk around Bakhmut. They've broken through in New York and Tourette's. Like, the story is, Ukraine is just slowly losing everywhere. Now, from General Syrskyi's perspective, I mean, the thing is, if you're fighting a war and you're in charge of the armed forces, like you have to act as if you can win the war. You can't whatever win the war means, even if it means frozen conflict or negotiated settlement. You have to organize your forces and utilize them in a way that you think is going to produce the best outcome. Now, anyone who's played a strategy game like an RTS or whatever, anything, that if you're far behind, right, if you're losing badly, you can either quit or keep playing. And if you're going to keep playing, well, you're going to play as if you can still win. And what you have to do at that point is exploit asymmetries. So you have to figure out what you can do that will exploit the maximum asymmetry between you and your opponent. And I mean, getting into some video gaming stuff, like I remember I used to play Warcraft 3 online way back in the day. So sometimes the way you could win if you were losing militarily, was build, siege units, which dealt massive damage to buildings and just sort of bypass the opponent's army, sneak some siege units like into their base and wipe out some critical infrastructure, right? So that's just an example of exploiting an asymmetry where, you're militarily defeated, but there's an asymmetry you can exploit where they've left a gap exposed, right? So if we consider that concept here, what have the Ukrainians done? From what we understand, they've taken their 3 top-tier NATO-trained brigades meant for the counteroffensive, and these have been deployed in various parts across the front that have had serious issues, like Avdiivka. So they've taken their best units with their best equipment and deployed them against Russia's worst units, which are just conscripts and border guards. And they're also doing a war of mobility where, what they're doing in Kursk is just a lot of driving around. And from what we understand, Russian fabs that we've talked about, those are best deployed against fixed positions. But as long as the Ukrainians keep moving and bypassing Russian fortifications, they can sort of exploit that asymmetry where if Russia has a big advantage in its guided bombs, well, let's use a strategy that avoids guided bombs as much as possible. So if we try to look at this from like the most steelman perspective, what the Ukrainians are doing is exploiting asymmetries between their forces in Kursk and the Russian capabilities in Kursk to sort of generate maximum advantage. And is this going to like win the war? No, but if they had reached the nuclear power plant or could even get it into artillery range or something like that, and there's also a gas distribution center in Sudza where they seem to actually have entrenched. And maybe they don't even get much further than this, but if they can entrench themselves on Russian territory through exploiting an asymmetry, this can potentially lead to a stronger negotiating position. So I think they're more than just like prestige or PR. There are some legitimate goals we can think about in this operation that make it make sense. Like operationally, this does make some sense, because if you look at the map, it's like, well, what is Ukraine going to do? They can't attack in Kherson. We've seen this front line's frozen. Donetsk is just an L. Luhansk is an L. Kharkov, who knows what was the plan here? I think the Russians are really undergoing basically an active defense here. The only option left, really, other than dragging Belarus of the war, which wouldn't even make any sense, is this offensive at Kursk. So I think there is a case, as crazy as an operation like this seems at this stage in the war, there's definitely a case you can make for it where they really only have Hail Marys at this point, right? It's like, again, you have to look at this from the Ukrainian perspective. It's like, well, do you just sit here and just lose slowly over time? No, you have to do something to try and win the war, even if that just means being in a better negotiating position.
I actually agree with you 100%, Charlemagne. You actually made a really good point here. They actually did some interviews with the Ukrainian units that took part in this Kursk offensive. A lot of them actually just got told, like, literally like 2 days before, like, hey, you're going to be dragged from the... And a lot of the units aren't just like strategic reserves. Like some of them, they actually pulled from the like Donbass front, which was kind of surprising to me. But a lot of these units actually said, like, yeah, we actually prefer attacking here in Kursk rather than just sitting in a trench, just waiting to get a glide bomb to death and, just waiting there for our deaths, basically. And they're like, give us the chance to actually do a Hail Mary. And I think that's exactly what this, I think obviously there's, as we mentioned with Kharkov, with the Russians, there's probably like different goals that the Ukrainians were trying to do in Kursk. And, one of probably the biggest thing they wanted to reach the nuclear power plant, had that under control. But then the second might be like, we just want to get enough territory to where we could negotiate that in negotiation. And as we've seen earlier, and I think I sent the article in the chat here, but apparently there's been like some secret negotiations going on. That's actually why we saw Zelensky saying we're actually open to the Russian in fact, he invited the Russians to his second peace conference. And so it looks like they're going to be sort of like some sort of like peace, like negotiations happening, and they want to get a better hand on that. The thing is, and this is what I've been saying to people in the pro-Russian side, is that the Kursk offensive actually is a good thing because it's, first of all, it drags the strategic reserves and grinds them down. And as we see right now, the Kursk offensive is now stalling into a more positional nature. Like, obviously what you said is completely true. Like in the first week where they were driving around, and that's why there's been a bunch of fog. They would drive up like 30 kilometers deep, but then take a picture, then have to withdraw. But but now the front is stabilizing, and when it stabilizes and the front is more like static, then the Russians will be able to actually use their glide bomb and positional advantage to like bomb them and drag them out like they did at any other part of the front. So in the first week, it was on the Ukraine. The Ukrainians had a bunch of the Russian advantages, but as we see now that the Russians actually put troops there, it's going to be a lot harder for the Ukrainians to continue doing their mobile offensive, and it'll be back to a positional conflict, which helps Russia in dragging them out. But also, one person made a very good point, and is that this was actually supposed to be a distraction operation. That Kursk was supposed to be a part one of a second part of a Ukrainian plan to take the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They actually tried to do this before, back in the fall of 2022. They launched a bunch of like dozens of special forces to try to seize a nuclear power plant, and they failed. But it looks like the goal was that they were going to try to like seize the plant and kind of use that as like a hostage situation. Like, hey, if you don't if you don't negotiate with us right now, we're going to blow up this plant. And they were going to attack Kursk, and just as they attacked in Belgorod before they did their 2023 offensive. And they actually did that in 2022 when they attacked in Kherson. And but then the Russians had Kharkov completely thinly manned, and then they attacked there. So the Ukrainians have a history of like where they attack in one area, but then it's they have another place they're going to attack from. And a lot of sources are saying their actually main objective is to take the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But also a lot of sources are saying that the Kursk offensive actually was a lot more successful than they anticipated. And so they're actually like putting the troops that they would have used for another part into the salient to try to, now to have a better negotiating position. And in fact, I think the presidential aide to Zelensky, I forgot the guy's name, but he basically said the main purpose is to have a better negotiating like a negotiation piece in future negotiations. But the thing is, this actually makes negotiations less likely. So, because now Putin, as we saw with this article that Charlemagne put up, like now, like there were some deals going on now. They're like, and even Putin himself said, yeah, we're not going to do negotiations anymore. So like this actually kind of backfired with them. And you also like, grind out your strategic reserves and make it easier for the Russians to achieve their goals in Donbass. So the Kursk offensive, it definitely was an embarrassment. It basically threw sand in Putin's eyes. He slipped on his banana. And so, it was a big banana moment. But the besides embarrassment and also for the PR thing, there were some operational like goals, obviously, and that that's completely right. It wasn't just for PR, but now basically the biggest thing they'll get from this is a PR thing, because this is going to lead to negotiations like they hoped.
Yeah, just to back you up on that, Ruski, I mean, we can't underestimate the amount of resources the Ukrainians have invested in this entire Kursk operation. I mean, the amount of videos coming, I love that picture. The amount of videos coming out of both the Russian and the Ukrainian side, like it wasn't just the fact that Ukraine sent in their best, Western trained brigades. It was the fact that they were getting close air support from MiG-29s. It was the fact that Ukraine transferred a bunch of anti-air batteries to Sumy region, and they actually did shoot down a Russian Su-24, I believe. I can't recall specifically the case, but like the amount of HIMARS strike. There was another video of a giant HIMARS strike targeting a concentration of a dozen Russian vehicles with dozens of Russian casualties on that side too. I mean, the amount of HIMARS and what the Russians have done, they've been releasing their own footage as well. We have confirmed evidence of a Patriot being blown up. We have confirmed evidence of an Iris-T anti-aircraft system being blown up. We have multiple HIMARS systems being blown up. The amount of vehicles and dead bodies being shared on the pro-Russian side of the media is absolutely insane. And that just goes to show you the amount of resources the Ukrainians really threw into this operation to, throw up the chessboard and change, the name of the game.
They're losing a lot of tanks from what I've seen in some of the pictures that have come out. Like I think they're losing a bunch of their. I think they're losing most of their remaining Challengers and
It's mostly
Or-
strikers as well. I think Russia
Yeah,
actually
they're-
took its first like striker trophy.
Yeah, I think also a lot of Bradleys aren't tanks, obviously, but I think they've been losing a bunch of Bradleys and strikers as well.
Yeah, that's something interesting about this offensive in Kursk is a lot of what we know geographically, like in terms of where the Ukrainians are. For one, Ukraine is releasing zero information, so the entire map is generated from Russian sources. But most of what we know about where the Ukrainians are seeing images of Lancet strikes or other destroyed Ukrainian vehicles. So it's like we're seeing a bunch of Ukrainian vehicles destroyed geolocated here, and it's not just it's a lot of the U.S. and European equipment too. So they are I don't know about casualties in terms of personnel, but they're taking a lot of casualties in terms of their best equipment, which is extremely limited.
These were huge amounts of resources, like dozens of Bradleys and Strikers. I mean, multiple HIMARS rocket systems, which they don't have many of, by the way, and which America does not produce very many of every year. And they have extremely limited anti-aircraft capabilities, and they have already lost 2 or 3, one Patriot and maybe another Iris-T, which is an Italian-French system, I believe.
I think they've
These
lost
are very limited
more-
resources.
Yeah, I think they've lost. Like, I think in the last week we saw like I think 3 confirmed HIMARS strikes just this week in the Sumy area, and I think a 4th one was unconfirmed. But like these are like before like HIMARS didn't like got introduced like over a year, like 2 years ago even now. I think it was like the summer of 2022. I think when they got introduced, but we didn't see a confirmed HIMARS kill until like there was one a few months ago that was the first confirmed like on camera one. And then, but now we saw like 3 in a row. I think we've seen like half of all the kills in this last week that have been destroyed confirmed in the entire Ukraine war, just in the Sumy area, and that just shows how important this operation is.
Yes, and I showed an article talking about a bridge that was destroyed like yesterday by one of these HIMARS strikes. It's somewhere on this river that I just highlighted.
Yeah, yes, I was going to talk. So, Glugoska right there. Yeah, so the bridge is in that area. I think it's the one that connects it, because this is the major right here. I think they destroyed this bridge, if I remember correctly, with the HIMARS strike. And that actually confirms that a lot of Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians are going to do another Hail Mary, or not Hail Mary, but like another push to try to reach this river. As you can see, that's to the back of Gluboshka, but it kind of runs along Ukraine-Russian border, and then kind of so everything to the south of that they're trying to capture. They destroyed the main one with a HIMARS strike, and have been striking like the 2 other smaller bridges in this area.
I mean, there's no reason to destroy these bridges unless you're planning on taking this territory.
Yeah, and that's what sources are saying, is that they might try to capture these everything to the south here, create basically a very strong bridgehead in Kursk for the Ukrainians, and then basically use all these lands to kind of for negotiation.
Yeah, because advancing to this river makes sense. I mean, the Ukrainians are also attacking and threatening attacks across other parts of the front too, like south of where they've advanced, and also to the north up here, because there's a highway right here. So there's the idea that the Ukrainians might launch another attack here. So if the Ukrainians can take everything south of this river here, and they launch an attack in this direction, obviously any Russians in this area end up in a very compromised position if they can get all the way to Rilisk, or however you pronounce that. So there's a possibility the Ukrainians could take much more territory here. Ultimately, I mean, whatever the Ukrainians do here at this point, it seems pretty obvious they're not going to reach the power plant. So like anything the Ukrainians take here, the problem they run into is all this territory, if they take it, can only really be used in negotiations. It doesn't affect the front at all, especially if the Russians are able to halt the Ukrainians and establish a solid front line with rear echelon forces. So the risk they're running here is that if this isn't used in negotiations, it's ultimately just a bunch of wasted effort, because the Russians can just push them out of here eventually. And if they don't stop pushing in the Donetsk, it's like, well, what does this actually do? So this is definitely a very risky maneuver, because ultimately, even if the Ukrainians are very successful here, it's completely disconnected from any other part of the front. And so long as the Russians can, bottle up the Ukrainians in this region, it strategically it does nothing.
It's going to force Russia to speed up their reserves because Russia is not going to take any troops away from the Donbass front. Like,
No.
it's too successful. They've been advancing even faster than they have in the previous weeks. So none of these troops are actually going to be leaving the front. They've already pulled troops out of Zaporozhye and Kherson, I believe, but it's going to cause the Russians to speed up other, strategic reserve units.
That's what I think
Russia
is going to happen. I think this is ultimately going to accelerate the war because the Russians are now much more motivated to defeat the Ukrainians, and the calculus is either you slow down your offensive here and put these forces over here to keep them out of Russia. But what I mean, the smarter move for the Russians, which appears to be what they're doing, is now that you've breached this line and are advancing deep into the enemy rear that isn't fortified as well as any of the front line, it's like you keep going.
They
don't
just
even...
pulled a bunch of their best units off.
Who did?
Ukraine did.
Right. I mean, well, it looks like what they've done is strip some units from all parts of the front to reinforce these three.
No, that's what I mean in terms of accelerating.
Yeah,
the balance
exactly.
of forces in there is even more in Russia's favor. Do any of you think part of this is to prevent negotiations from happening?
Possibly yes, because the thing is, the Ukrainians may be assuming that Trump gets elected, and from what we understand is that Trump's position is he's going to force negotiations by, if the Ukrainians refuse to negotiate, he's going to cut off all weapons. If the Russians refuse to negotiate, he's going to dump all weapons possible into Ukraine. So the calculus here from the Ukrainian perspective is, okay, if we can do something that will cause the Russians to say, we're not negotiating, Trump is basically saying he's going to open the spigot on giving us weapons. So there's that perspective too, where the Ukrainians are totally dependent on the US. So looking at it from that perspective, if you can do something that will stop the Russians from negotiating, and you say, yeah, we'll negotiate, well, Trump allegedly is going to give you tons more weapons. Now, who knows the extent to which that's actually possible and would do anything, right? But again, we have to look at this from the Ukrainian perspective. What do you do to win or generate more advantage is you cancel negotiations. You get the Russians to
cancel. I was thinking even just domestically, if there's any kind of internal pressure, this prevents that from happening.
From the Russian side?
No, in Ukraine.
I don't know. Yeah,
I don't think there is that much.
I don't think the Ukrainians are eager to negotiate.
Yeah,
I don't get the sense that they are.
Yeah. There's been polling done for the Ukrainians, which says that now, to be fair, it's been increasing, but what they expect is they're fine with a peace that is basically like a ceasefire on current lines, but by a vast majority, I think 90% say they refuse to accept the deal that Putin wanted, which was to give up the 4 oblasts. I think right now it's I think it's starting to become a major, 50%, when are now in favor of negotiating a peace, but only along the current front lines. So it's definitely an increase from previous months, but the Ukrainians are still want to fight, basically.
Now there's a bigger question I want to bring up. Does Russia care what happens in the US election?
It depends on how serious they take Trump. I mean, they definitely do. I think they would rather the Democrats win the election because,
yeah,
I mean, from their perspective, they don't want to negotiate right now because they're still basically in the same position as before, where they want a lot more territory than they've taken. And if what's going to happen is Trump is going to ramp up support for Ukraine if they refuse to negotiate, that's really bad. So, there's this weird idea. It comes from the Russia narrative, right? That Trump is pro-Russian, but he's really not. And he will probably put the screws on Russia in a real way, not in some BS sanctions economic way. But, I don't have any reason to disbelieve that he would use military means to try and force negotiations if that were possible. So I don't think the Russians want Trump in. I think the Ukrainians do want Trump in, and I'm sure they're watching that very
Interesting.
closely.
But I guess kind of the broader point is, will Russia adjust any of what it's doing on the battlefield to influence the election? Because my impression of Russia, if I can use a Batman Begins reference, is don't sacrifice sure footing for a killing blow. I think that the Russian general staff has a plan, and by and large, Putin's just letting them run the war without pandering too much to political considerations. So I could see Russia just has a strategic plan in their own timetable, and whatever happens in the U.S. election is just not relevant to it. They're
Well,
just going to do.
I think so. I think if Trump actually reinforces Ukraine, that's not great. But I think the Russians are perfectly prepared to, fight on whatever terms are necessary. So whatever happens in the election, I don't think it's really affecting their strategic thinking, or at least strategic thinking in terms of what territories they're looking to annex in Ukraine.
I mean, more like their timetable. I think also they just don't think any of these people are like serious adults, like that Blinken and all these other people are. So they're just like, look, we're done trying to figure out what they want. We're just going to settle this on the battlefield. We're not going to it's just nothing's going to happen. Because I mean, they are quite buffoonish. I particularly like to make fun of Blinken, but they're just. I think Russia's just tired of trying to deal with them.
And I think Russia knows time is on its side. Whether it's Kamala or Trump, it matters, but it matters, but in the strategic sense, I think Putin is very well aware that time is on Russia's side, and there's still another 4 months until the next president is inaugurated. But that's all I have to say. I'm gonna actually have to get going, gents. It's been a great stream. It's a pleasure for you to have me on, Charlie.
Excellent. Yeah, so we will start wrapping up in any case. So thanks for coming on, and look forward to having you next time.
And Mandro, congratulations on your cigar. We'll see you at the next meetup.
That might be a bit premature there, Hunger, but okay.
A little bit. I'm still holding out hope. Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Yeah, so yeah, I think the Russians have every incentive really to just settle this on the battlefield. I think timetable wise, that might be why they're pushing so hard into nets, because if they can make a case that, the Ukrainians are defeated by the time Trump is in office, they have a much better position. And, politically, we see, the Kursk offensive could have caused panic, and Putin could have ordered, troops moved from the Donetsk front for here, but that didn't happen. It appears that this offensive has, it's caused a lot of panic in the Russian mapper channels and the all of those guys. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, it's understandable, but the Russians are very, very, very sensitive about their territorial integrity. I've noticed, even though it's really obvious that this is going to go nowhere. And the thing is, what options does Ukraine have left at this point? I mean, this is the only part of the front, other than Belarus, but that would be pointless. This is the only part of the front that's really an opening to act on. So if the Russians can shut this down or contain it, I mean, there's no options left on the table.
I find the pro-Russian mappers tend to be very much the sky is falling. If anything
yes, it's pretty funny. I mean, I don't want to make too light of it because it's they're literally massacring civilians and stuff across the border here. But no, it's the last 2 or 3 weeks have just been the Russian military mappers have just been in total the sky is falling mode. They're just they only look at the Kursk front, and they're obviously panicking, even though there's really nothing to panic over. So I don't know. I found that a little bit of amusing because the Russians are just absolutely killing it everywhere, but they're in total panic mode over this.
I find the Russian blacktail side is almost as big as the Russian. Well, maybe not almost as big. It's bigger than I think. It's funny if you watch Russians with attitude ever, because they're just really cynical and they're just convinced that Putin's gonna back down at the last minute and
Ukraine's
gonna join NATO.
They're constantly terrified that Putin is just going to throw the entire war. He's just going to decide, one day that it's time for Russia to just lose, and he's just going to give the West everything they want. It's pretty funny. One
thing I would add though is that if you're from a pro-Russian perspective, like the whole point of this is that to basically reconquer kind of historic Russian lands. Like if you look at the history, like, you know, things like the difference between someone living in Kharkov versus Belgorod, there's like no difference. There's no, like, they all they all spoke Russian. They all are of the same race, basically. The difference between Ukrainian and Russian is like, there's no like ethnic difference between them for the most part. And you know, a lot of these historic Russian, Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnieper, and so, you know, all these are like places that were established by Russians. Like these cities were created by Russian settlers who came there after they defeated the Crimean Khanate. And so like these were built up by Russians, and they were part of Russia for hundreds of years. And even if Putin gets what he wants with his 4 oblasts, like that still leaves a bunch of his that still means that Ukraine is still controlled by an anti-Russian regime. And also that leaves out a bunch of cities that are historically Russian, like Kharkov and Odessa, as still under Ukrainian control right now. Like and Ukrainians have admitted this, like the presidential aide to Zelensky said, you know, once we reach Crimea, we're going to like deport all the Russians there and like basically bring back the Muslims, the Tartars and all that. They're like, oh, we're gonna bring it back, you know, bring them back and kick all the Russians out. And ethnic, they've been banning Russian. They've been banning all the Russian cultural traditions. And so, like, as from a pro-Russian perspective, it's like, you know, even if Putin gets all he wants, it's like, well, you know, you're still leaving a bunch of Ukraine. You're still leaving Ukraine under Russian, under basically an anti-Russian regime, and you still leave a bunch of land as part of that regime. And obviously this whole point wasn't even about land. It was about bringing Ukraine back to the Russian orbit. And the only way you'll ever do that is if you eliminate the regime in Kiev. And so a lot of, and that does not even come to that does not even talk about in terms of like if Putin accepts a ceasefire on current lines, you know, which is still now I think that's thrown out the window. But as we saw, that this is something they've been negotiating on. And so, you know, obviously, like that leaves Donetsk still under Ukraine control. That leaves, you know, core Russian territory that's now part of Russia, like Zaporozhye and Kherson, under Ukraine control. So there's still, like, as we mentioned, Putin is not a conqueror. He's not someone who wants to actually, like, you know, conquer Ukraine. He's trying to win this war in the most humanitarian way possible. And, you know, a lot of pro-Russian doomerism is because they're always afraid that Putin at the last minute will kind of cuck out, kind of with the same thing with what happened with the Minsk agreements in 2024, or sorry, in 2014, where when the Donbass militias were able to, they were about to attack Mariupol, for example, and then the Russians told them to stop because they were going to do a peace with Ukraine. Because again, they don't want to, like, threaten the status quo. So I understand the doomerism. Putin can be a lot more harder on Ukraine, or maybe it's just all front. Maybe he just wants to have the veneer of being like a peaceful person, and like, but really he actually does want to.
I mean, there's also the Chinese, and Russia's various allies that they have to keep happy. Because part of their continuing to do business with Russia is based on various things in international law. I do think, just as far as territorial, I think the next stretch goal is probably going to be Kharkov and Odessa. I think particularly among Russian nationalists, there's a lot of desire to get those two cities, as they're kind of seen as wasn't Odessa one of the great successes of the of Catherine the Great when
in fact, she's the one who, like, she sent Potemkin, one of her advisors, she's the one who, like, established she's the one who under her reign established cities like Sevastopol, Kherson, Dnieper, and Odessa. So, like, a lot of these, and then a lot of these are just part of Russia always, like Kharkov and things like that. But, like, yeah, a lot of they call it Novorossiya, which means New Russia, and basically was an uninhabited. Like, it was uninhabited because the Crimean Khanate, which was a client state of the Ottoman Empire, and they were using it for slave raids to take Slav women back to the Ottoman Empire. So that's why there was not a lot of people there when the Russians defeated the Crimean and annexed it, the open steppe basically was settled in by Russians, and that's why Ukraine up until recently spoke Russian, because everyone there was basically Russian. And that's why there's a strong desire by Russian nationalists to like not let these core Russian lands be under an anti-Russian regime, like it is, as we see.
Yeah, but like I don't think they.
Yeah,
care
if we
at
sort
all
of get
about
into the
West
ethnic
Ukraine.
history of the region, I mean, Crimea down here was not Ukrainian. This area is what you would call Ukrainian, and this area, which is like Novorossiya, is more ethnically Russian. So that's basically like, and you see this if you just look at like voting records for Ukraine going back to the end of the Soviet Union. The more west you get, west of the Dnieper, the more Ukrainian, the more these oblasts vote like ethnically Ukrainian, and these tend to vote more ethnically Russian. Like
I don't think outside of like the most hardcore Russian nationalists, anyone's really interested in Western Ukraine.
no, definitely not. I mean, I've talked about this. I don't know if I've talked about it on stream, but I think the way the war will end in the negotiations is I suspect that there will be more referendums, and basically all of the oblasts will vote. And I expect something like these oblasts at least will vote to become part of Russia. Possibly Sumy might as well, maybe Dnipro will, but I sort of suspect that there's just going to be a nationwide referendum in Ukraine. And I don't think that the Russians are ever going to attack Odessa, but there's a lot of reason, obviously, for the Russians to want to take these territories and unite with Transnistria.
I think Kharkov is probably part of their end goal at this point.
Probably, yeah. And I mean, looking at this map and the Kursk offensive, we can really understand the sensitivity of the Russians over the issue. I mean, you can even see from this zoomed out view how far the Ukrainians got. I mean, if the Ukrainians had actually launched an attack, or NATO had launched an attack, I mean, Moscow's not that far from the borders of Ukraine, and there's really nothing in the way here in terms of canalizing terrain to stop the NATO forces potentially from reaching Moscow. So I kind of expect that the Russians in a referendum would be very interested in these regions as well. Kiev, maybe the city gets split in half or something, and there's Ukrainian side here. Who knows? But I sort of suspect the war is going to end in some sort of a referendum, and Russia's just going to get what it wants that way after the Ukrainians are defeated militarily.
I'm going to be honest. Even if I was like a Ukrainian patriot, at this point, I'd probably just accept Russian overlordship, because Ukraine's not going to be able to rebuild any of these areas.
Well, yeah, it's like economically, like which post-war, which country would you rather be part of, Ukraine or Russia? Obviously, if you live, especially east of the Dnieper, you would rather have your oblast annexed by Russia. It's not like they're there like oppressing you or something. It's just purely from economic incentives. Like, how would you vote? You'd have to be insane. You'd have to be some like insane Ukrainian nationalist to vote to become part of Ukraine if you're like living in Kharkov or something.
Well, I mean, they're not going to ethnically cleanse these. They're probably going to be Russified, but they're going to rebuild them. It's not like it doesn't serve Russia to have like crappy destroyed territory.
No, because like that's the thing too, is like all the shit Russia's destroying, that they've said like this is Russia. So literally the Russians are destroying Russia.
Well, Mariupol's getting rebuilt pretty quick.
It is, yeah, but I mean, look at Bakhmut, which has been leveled, right? That didn't happen in Mariupol. Like all of this stuff, Avdiivka, like Russia has to pay to rebuild all of this. So there's going to be an expense after the war just in rebuilding these cities and areas. And yeah, you can talk about like creating jobs and all of that, but it's a serious cost being imposed on them. Like they don't want to like destroy everything they're intending to annex, especially not a city like Kharkov. Like, could you imagine if what happened in Bakhmut happened in Kharkov? Like how much economic damage that would be. That's like the last things the
also
Russians
just
want.
all the historical stuff, and
yeah, for sure. So yeah, probably about time to start wrapping up here. Does anyone have any final thoughts they want to convey?
I guess just maybe when do you think that this is going to end? Um,
I think it could last another 900 days. I mean, you got to give it to the Ukrainians that they really seem like they're not even close to the breaking point in terms of morale. And given the pace of the war, it seems like, they'll be able to drag it out for quite a while longer.
or sorry, I
So
should have defined what end means. But yeah, I don't know. I think it could be anywhere from like a couple months to a couple years. I think it really depends how much Russia wants to sacrifice.
yeah, I expect it's going to be years. I mean, this breakthrough in Pokrovsk and Donetsk, if that turns into a rout, things could change. I don't think it will. I think once the Russians reach Pokrovsk, especially, they're really going to start slowing down. But who knows? I mean, the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can keep fighting, and even undermanned and without the necessary artillery, somehow they're able to hold off the Russians from completely throwing them into a rout. So I don't know. To me, it looks like a few more years, maybe another 2 years. Probably not much longer than that. I'd be surprised if it was more than 2 years.
Well, there's not just the military, there's the morale, there's the economy, there's the energy situation. But I don't, like I said, it could be any amount of time.
Well, I think if Kursk is thrown back, I mean, the Kursk offensive can really backfire in that long run because if the Russians eject them and then even counterattack into Sumy, the Ukrainian morale is going to, start exponentially dropping. So that's sort of the risk with this sort of operation is it increases morale in the short term, but in the long term, if it's overthrown, that's going to accelerate the decline, especially because all of your really good equipment is being destroyed there, and by moving your anti-air to the border, Patriot systems and HIMARS as well for hitting ground targets, you're now risking all of that too. So I think the Kursk offensive is ultimately actually going to accelerate the end of the conflict. But yeah, that's all the thoughts I have. Anyone else got anything? If not, we can close out.
Nope.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Mandrill, you can shill anything you have first if you have anything to shill.
Sure. So, like usual, I will show the Old Glory Club. Go like and subscribe to their Substack and YouTube channel. I made an appearance on the OGC Pony Express Radio this past Thursday. I have a couple articles I'm planning to write for them in the near future. And I have articles on my own Substack as well. And one of these days here, probably Tuesday, I will get back to reading through Brian Burroughs' Days of Rage. So look for that coming out soon.
Yeah, and here's our website. We've got 6 chapters now, so if you're in any of these areas, you can check them out. Some of them have contact info on their pages, for example. So
Are you going to open the
reach out.
Canadian branch?
We're American only, although there could be a possibility for like a brother organization in Canada if Canadians want to spin it up. But it wouldn't be under our banner. It would be,
yeah, I see how it is.
So yeah, Argent, do you wanna
Sure.
anything?
So you can check out my channel, Argent, same as my name. I cover a whole bunch of stuff. I cover the Russo-Ukraine war in kind of a darkly humorous way. I call it the Ukraine Cinematic Universe. I also just do a lot of reviews of like movies and video games and stuff, and just all kinds of different stuff I cover. So check it out.
All right, and then yes, finally, Wandering Ruski. I will bring up your channel as well.
Yeah. So you could check out my channel, Wandering Ruski. I do my weekly Russia-Ukraine war updates. I basically go over the changes on the ground for the entire front. I talk about the gains that were made, the tactical importance of them, and things of that nature. I also right now that's the main focus of my channel. You can see it on the screen right now. And you guys if you guys want to follow this war and just even if you're just a casual observer, maybe you don't have the time to see what's actually going on day to day. You could like just watch one of my weekly uploads, and you could see what's actually been happening on the ground. They're usually about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how much happened during the week. So yeah, just check it out.
Yeah, definitely recommend Summoning Salt as well, if you like the history of speedruns. Anyway, all right, thanks for coming on, guys. This has been fun, and we'll do it again probably for the 1,000th day. I think once we reach 1,000 days, which is like 3 months from now, I might do another stream, depending on what happens. All right, so with that, I'll go close it out. Thanks, everybody.